Credit. That is the topic for today because we've got a ton to talk about. There has been a lot going on. Some of it was, buried underneath the focus on the Iran conflict and the oil shock, and some of that's related to what we're going to talk about here. But just isolating and talking about private credit itself, there is a lot to be concerned about. In fact, we've been monitoring and following what's going on for quite some time because nothing ever seems to change. We seem to be on a one-way highway down this road toward what really seems to be a credit crisis. In many ways, I think, especially after we get through with today's video, you're going to see how it actually is a credit crisis, as well as how it stacks up with, yes, I'm going to make the comparison, 2008. And before I get too far into that, first of all, I want everybody to know we will be having a question and answer session after I'm done with the presentation here. We do have a lot to get through, but I want to answer as many questions as I possibly can from that you might have, because this is really important stuff. And I don't think enough people really appreciate what's happening and why it's happening, which is why we are doing this webinar. What is it we're talking about when we talk about private credit? What do the 2008 comparisons really mean? Spoiler alert, it doesn't mean a rerun of 2008. What we're talking about is a repeating pattern of human behavior. As I keep saying, human nature is undefeated in these bubble periods. And because of that, our real purpose and our real focus is on understanding and even mapping out the changing states that go along with something like a bust becoming a crisis. Not only understanding what that means about as far as how we got to this point, but also using that same mapping technique to look ahead at possibly not only where we're going, but what would we need to look for in order to have a really good handle and understanding about what it means moving forward or moving ahead. So what we're really going to focus on here is how these processes work. And we're going to start with, I'm going to make some 2008 comparisons. I think it's a pretty good place to start. We're going to start with subprime mortgages. Now, I say all the time that subprime mortgages, there's this common perception that the 2008 crisis was all about subprime mortgages. And I say all the time, it wasn't really about subprime mortgages. And let Ben Bernanke explain to you why that was the case. In fact, in 2009 or 2010, I think it was 2010, February 2010, Ben Bernanke sat in front of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, the FCIC, and told them what you see on the screen here. Prospective subprime losses were clearly not large enough on their own to account for the magnitude of the crisis. And then he gets into the real stuff. The stuff that we talk about here at Eurodollar University, though it's clear that Ben Bernanke never really grasped the full part of it, even though the Bank of Sweden gave him a Nobel Prize about 10 years later for trying to explain what he got wrong in 2007, 2008, and 2009. But basically, it's never the credit losses that kill you. Just like in the 1920s and early 1930s, the Great Depression was not necessarily about the credit losses. It was about the changing state between the pre-crisis period and what became the post-crisis period. I've talked about this on YouTube recently quite a bit. What really happens is expectations are up here, and then they have to be recalibrated down here. And in that process, that recalibration process, it potentially unleashes what we call a state change. And that's what we focus on. That's what we do here at Eurodollar University. In fact, this is the whole point we exist. Our macroeconomic and monetary analysis is about analyzing various states and wondering and trying to figure out from the various clues that we have, various information that we have, if a state is changing and what that absolutely means. In 2008, we start out with subprime is contained, and then it ends up with somehow we have this massive crisis. And then after the crisis, the Federal Reserve actually made money off of the crisis. Now, when Ben Bernanke said subprime losses clearly were not large enough, he wasn't just speaking out of conjecture. He wasn't just spitballing. The Federal Reserve had bailed out AIG as well as Bear Stearns, at least some of their assets. They bought some of their assets to make the takeover from Bear Stearns from JP Morgan palatable and workable. They created these hedge funds called Maiden Lane. And Maiden Lane took some of the most toxic of toxic waste. And just to show you right here, a concrete example to break down this misconception, subprime mortgages and subprime losses were never big enough. Ben Bernanke was not lying in 2010 when he said that. In fact, when the Federal Reserve bought these toxic waste assets from both Bear Stearns and AIG, Bear Stearns was Maiden Lane 1 or Maiden Lane LLC, and the AIG assets were Maiden Lane 2 and Maiden Lane 3, as you can see, over time, not only did the Fed not lose money on those investments, they made a ton. Look at Maiden Lane 3. The Fed paid out $24 billion, a little bit over $24 billion to buy those assets from AIG, and it ended up getting almost $31 billion in payments over the life of that hedge fund Maiden Lane, which is about 10 years. So the Fed made almost $6.7 billion in profit off of subprime mortgage assets. And they weren't specifically subprime mortgage assets, but they were toxic waste assets, which tells you right away, and this is what's applicable to March of 2026, it's not the losses that kill you. Instead, it's something else. It's the process. It's the way that we go from here expectations to recalibrating expectations and what that means in between. It's not about credit losses. It's about this entire process. It's understanding behavioral changes and state changes. So the Fed went from, we got to buy toxic waste to bail out the banking system, to making money on the toxic waste, because in the end, it's not about the toxic waste. It's why people believe it's toxic waste. That's the point we need to focus on here. And it is a total misconception. And really what we're going to go through here is something that I did myself at the time, though. Back then I didn't have any formal understanding of what we're really trying to do, or what I was trying to do and accomplish in trying to dig through all of this material and really put together some kind of comprehensive and workable roadmap about what was going on in 2008. But it was basically the same process. It's just in my head, it was a less formal structure. So we're going to formalize this structure. And I've talked about this repeatedly too, stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. But to understand how we go from February, March of 2007, Ben Bernanke said subprime was contained. And by the way, most people believed him. When he said that in March of 2007 in front of Congress, most people said, okay, subprime is contained. Why would we think any different? Then just a little over a year later, not even a year later, we've got this massive meltdown that takes place. These assets are turned into toxic waste. And then a couple of years after that, the Federal Reserve is making money off of these toxic waste assets, which, by the way, a little bit of digression here, you could kind of understand where all the conspiracy theories came from the 2008 crisis, because Fed says we don't have a crisis. We get a massive crisis. The Fed makes money off the crisis. And then, of course, if people believe the Fed didn't just make money off the crisis, a bunch of Wall Street cronies, all the Fed's buddies made a ton of money off the crisis. But we're missing something. We're missing quite a lot. We can't go from subprime is contained to subprime mortgages were not enough for losses with having a major meltdown and toxic waste in between. We need to get into that process and understand what it really is. So that's what we're going to be doing here. We're going to be following the clues after we get through understanding what that process really is. It is all about behavioral changes that accumulate to become state changes. When I say state changes, I'll go through a quick example of what a state change is so we can understand we're all on the same page. So we're going to be looking for clues. We're going to be looking for clues about all the stuff I just said. We're going to be mapping our states. We're going to take our model of how crises develop and apply that to the 2008. Yes, I know we're back testing a model here, which people hate, but like I said, I did this in real time in 2008 and it worked really well. So we're going to apply our model of state changes and analyzing state changes to the 2008 crisis, at least the first half of it, because it's really easy. And you can see exactly how it fits together. We're going to go through some hypothetical exercises for what behavioral changes and state changes mean in 2026 with the private credit bust as it is developing here. We're going to go through some of the latest developments, of course. But it really comes down to an accumulation of behavioral changes that lead us to believe that a state change has taken place, which means a change of state of the actual function of the system. Plus, we're going to corroborate that with all these other signals that we continue, the esoteric signals, as George Gammon likes to call them, that we look for here at Eurodollar University. So let's start with an example of a state change. It's a very simple one. Anybody who's been watching Eurodollar University for any length of time over the last couple years now, I've been mentioning flat beverage. The beverage curve, its real usage, it's not a mathematical relationship between labor demand and unemployment, but it basically describes a relationship that is at its heart a state change. So we start out with falling demand for labor. So that's the curve going down, job openings fall, demand for labor goes down. But in that initial state, it doesn't lead to an increase in unemployment. It's just falling demand for labor. The economy is generally fine. But however, you get to a certain point, and this point is unknowable, and that's why we use the beverage curve, because the beverage curve gives us at least a rough guide for where we should expect this to take place. But demand for labor continues falling, but in this lower part of the curve, something has changed. Something has changed. Labor demand hasn't changed. Labor demand is still falling, but at some point, it triggers unemployment. Labor demand falls enough that the entire shape of the labor market shifts. Where before labor demand fell and nothing, the state of the economy, the state of the system, the state of employment didn't really shift. Suddenly, labor demand goes beyond a certain threshold, and the entire character of the labor market shifts to something completely different. All of a sudden, falling demand, which before did not trigger unemployment, suddenly it starts to trigger not just unemployment, but growing levels of unemployment. That is an example of a state change, and we use the beverage curve to try to give us a rough estimate of where that might be taking place in the real economy. In fact, we can actually date it, and we actually know where it's coming from, which is why I've been referring to the beverage curve since 2023. August of 2023, not only was that the aftermath of the banking crisis in 2023, it was also the first major oil spike after 2022. And then April 2024 was right after the second major oil spike of 2023-2024, the second one being the Yemeni rebels. So we can see what happened is the cumulative effect of the banking crisis aftermath plus rising energy costs for non-economic reasons, an oil shock, an energy shock, it led to conditions where lower demand for workers triggered that state change. The entire state of the labor market underwent a significant shift, which meant that now a loss of demand or lack of demand or falling demand leads to rising unemployment. That's an example of a state change. We're going to apply that same principle, the same idea, to credit markets and really the credit cycle. Now, I've been talking about this too for quite some time, really going back to last year. There are basically 3 stages to a credit cycle downturn. And keep in mind here, what we're really looking for to try to identify these stages are, like I said before, as we'll see when we get to the 2000 example, behavioral changes that when they accumulate suggest very strongly that the state of the credit market and the state of the credit cycle has shifted to something else. And when we go through the examples, you'll see exactly what I mean here. But the stage 1, just to go through this, because there's a lot of new people here attending, maybe you're hearing this for the first time. Stage 1 is where after going through a credit bubble, and maybe not everybody's aware that it was a bubble, stage 1 is where people start to see that it was a bubble and start to understand that the implications of that being a bubble mean that there's a significant downside potentially ahead. So in stage 1 of the downside of the credit cycle, people realize there's something different. And it's a gray swan here because some people call it a black swan. That's certainly the term black swan was used for the 2008 crisis, which is complete crap because it was instead more like a gray swan. And a gray swan is simply everybody knows and can see that there is a bubble, but people choose to ignore it. So it's not like it was completely unexpected. It's just that people just decided they were going to dismiss all of the negative signals and just get on with the making money and all of the stuff that goes along with the credit bubble. So it's not a black swan. It's a gray swan that everybody ignores until it becomes too difficult to set aside and dismiss. So in stage 1 of the crisis, that's what happens. Suddenly people say, oh, crap, when did that gray swan get here? It's been there the entire time. But people start to realize something is very different. What happens in stage 1 is basically the results and the events and the developments that take place establishes that there was a bubble, and a bubble, what we really mean is a dislocation or an imbalance, but basically an error. We talk about it all the time here in 2025 and 2026, the garbage lending, as Jeffrey Gunlett called it. That was the error. So in any bubble period, it's a bunch of errors that accumulate, the bubble goes up, and then stage 1 of the downturn, people start to see that there was an error. So something happens or a bunch of things happen that really not only punctuate the fact that there was an error or something different, but that it was indeed a bubble on the way up. So in that first stage, we start to see money coming out. That's the first behavioral change. That's the one that you really need to look for in the first stage. So money flows out, behavior starts to change among investors. And because we're talking about here a credit cycle, we're looking for what investors are perceiving and doing. Stage 2 is when behavior starts to change again. Not only do we have investors asking for their money back, but also banks, which were willing to stand behind the system in stage 1, are less willing to do so because suddenly they see the gray swan too. In other words, the errors become established enough, even the banking sector, which has oftentimes vested interest in standing behind whatever it is that went into a bubble. And that was also true, as we'll see in 2008. Banks had every interest in trying to work out the credit crisis before it became too far. So in stage one, banks are willing to stand behind, or they're able to stand behind. Stage two, another behavioral shift. Largely the banking system begins to step back, and then the bank support begins to disappear. That's a state change. You have an accumulation of behavioral changes that lead to a change in overall condition and character of the credit cycle downturn, where you start to see selling actually take place. It's not the losses that kill us, it's the selling that ends up killing us because of the state changes. And stage three is just where everything goes completely to the next level. There's another series of behavioral changes which lead to another state of the credit cycle downturn, which leads to not just a little bit of selling, but then you get some of the more panic and distressed and fire sale selling that leads to markets becoming illiquid. And that's where you get from subprime is contained to holy crap, what just happened in 2008. It's really about these different state shifts that go on as we go from one to the next to the next. And in those state changes and those that were caused by behavioral shifts, we go from something like subprime mortgages being something to be concerned about to the entire mortgage space becoming toxic waste. It's not toxic waste, but it becomes perceived to be toxic waste because it's all about behavior and perception. Now, I've just went through these stages, and I go through these stages quite often in our YouTube videos, as well as in our Eurodollar University material. But we have to also keep in mind that they're not hard and fast, that each stage is not a discrete thing. While we're looking to identify, an accumulation of behavioral changes that look like they're consistent with each of these stages I've described them, the truth is they kind of blend together because we're talking about, messy human nature. It's not so easy to just say, okay, stage one is here. It's defined by this set of characteristics, and stage one ends when we get to this set of characteristics. They kind of really do blend together. So you really have to be on your toes with your analysis because you get a blend of stage one into stage two or stage two into stage three, and it makes the job a little bit more difficult, a lot more difficult. But realizing that means that, you can get a mix of behaviors, which reinforces the notion here. It's not about one behavioral change or another. It's really about an accumulation of behaviors together that give us confirmation, or at least confidence, that the state of the system has changed to roughly correspond with these stages as I've mapped them out here. So stage one doesn't just end on one day and stage two begins the next. Stage one, you get an increasing sense. You see more and more developments that are consistent with behavioral changes to the point that you think, okay, stage one has happened. That's a state change from the previous bubble. And then you start to get some more behavioral shifts that over time you get enough accumulation that you say, okay, the state of the credit cycle and really the economy too has shifted to it looks like stage two and to stage three and so on. So you get an accumulation of behavioral changes with each of these stages that eventually what we're really looking for are these state changes, because that really tells you where you are, and not only where you are, but it gives you a sense of probabilities of where things are going. And where things are going, the probability shift there as well. And inevitably the outcome, or at least the outcome that's at the end of the line here, not a whole lot of positive scenarios if you keep changing from one state to the next along this progression. That's really the point here. We're not just filling this out conceptually. We're trying to fill out this conception in order to be able to use it in a real world, meaningful sense. So let's do that. Let's backtrack and back test this model in the 2008 crisis, at least the lead up to the 2008 crisis and the first part of it. Now, the 2008 crisis was actually, loosely speaking, two crises back to back. So there was the first crisis up until Bear Stearns. There was a little bit of a pause in between up until around summer of 2008. Then there was the second part of the crisis, which was the much worse one. And you can actually do the same model on the second half of the crisis too, though it's much more condensed in stage one and stage two. It's sort of just sprang right into stage three almost immediately with, September of 2008. But I think this is a perfect illustration of exactly what I'm talking about here. So we start out in March of 2007, actually before March of 2007, I think this was February. What we're looking for, again, stage one, clues that tell us behavior is shifting to realizing that something is different. Before it was credit bubble. It was the housing bubble. The housing bubble had already started to bust a little bit. Prices were coming down. Some of the housing statistics were getting weak. And then along comes Freddie, who says, we're not going to buy any subprime securities or subprime assets or subprime mortgages. We're not going to make any of those. We're not going to buy any of those securities. So that was already there, a warning sign that the behavior of the system was shifting, because here we had this powerful big GSE saying something is different. And for the first time, people started to talk about subprime mortgages. Now, in between then, in March of 2007, as I just went over, Ben Bernanke said subprime was contained. And at the time, people believed him, because why wouldn't they? Recency bias, most of all, which is one reason why we go through this process, because you don't want to fall into recency bias. And if you don't know what recency bias is, it's simply this logical fallacy that because nothing bad has happened, at least in recent times, recency bias, that means somehow that nothing bad can happen. In many ways, by going through this exercise, what you're really doing is trying to check your recency bias, because you're being aware of, or trying to be aware of, these behavioral changes that tell you you're looking at things the wrong way, because we're seeing all of these increasing signals that suggest the state of the system has indeed changed, even if it doesn't look like anything like it had beforehand. So by late March, early April 2008, we had New Century bankrupt, which was, in the parlance of 2025 and 2026, the first cockroach. The first cockroach that shows up, and the markets were a little bit worried about what was taking place at the time. But again, it was looked upon a lot like, last fall, where the market said, okay, that's probably not good, but we're not really sure it means anything just yet. After all, Ben Bernanke just said subprime was contained. So we got one bankruptcy. Maybe that's an outlier. But you can see how we're starting to accumulate these behaviors that suggest that there's more going on here than just one-offs here and there. Instead, the accumulation of downturn suggests that the state of the system has shifted out of its bubble high and into the downswing and the crisis. That's what we're looking for. So S&P starts to downgrade MBS. Bear Stearns, if you remember, I went over this last fall. Bear Stearns hedge funds played an important role in establishing the state change into stage one of the downturn. First, they had to rescue the funds, and then, as we'll see in just a second, they actually shut them down. We get more downgrades from S&P. So again, you're getting confirmation. There is a behavioral shift underway from inside the system that tells you the state of the system has shifted into something else. Countrywide makes a liquidity warning. Now we're getting into July of 2007. IKB we'll talk about in just a minute here, but that was a big one. That was a German. This is how you knew it was global. And again, you can start to see it's getting more and more serious. A lot of German regional firms and regional banks over there were running into problems because of what was supposed to be a U.S. mortgage problem or a U.S. real estate problem. So now you have these German regional firms that were begging regional governments in Germany to bail them out because of what was supposed to be subprime contained. It was again confirmation of something, a significant behavioral change, not just in S&P or Freddie Mac, but this system itself. Notice how these events, they imply something bigger and something deeper. That's really where the behavioral shift comes in. And then you get Bear Stearns, which gives up its rescue of its hedge funds and instead decides to liquidate them, which tells you behavioral changes among hedge fund investors, behavioral change among Bear Stearns management and how they respond to hedge fund investors. Again, suggesting very much that something big has changed, an accumulation of behavioral changes that suggests the state has shifted into stage one at the very least. American Home Mortgage declares bankruptcy. There's another cockroach that shows up, again, confirming the error, establishing the error of the bubble. And then we get to August 9th of 2007. That was a big one. We talk about this at Eurodollar University every August 9th, even though, what is it now? We're almost 19 years later because we are living in the shadow of August 9th, 2007. And August 9th, 2007, what it suggested, the events of that day, there were a couple things that happened, but the proximate cause of the breakdown was BNP Paribas decided to suspend the net asset value calculation of a couple of its funds, 3 of its funds, which you don't need to get into the details here. But what that said was, it wasn't just a behavioral change for BNP. BNP was being forced to react to systemic behavioral changes, confirmation that we hadn't just, that the credit system hadn't just shifted to the stage one state, it was now shifting even further. We're starting to get an accumulation of behaviors that suggest the state of the downturn, the state of the credit environment was shifting even further into what became stage 2. So not only do we had BNP and the events of August 9th, and we had Countrywide, which drew down on a massive $11.5 billion of revolving lines, which is stage 1 behavior because those banks were standing behind the system a little bit there. But again, it told you that the system itself, the private marketplace, funding markets and wholesale markets were experiencing great difficulty. Then you got the failure of Northern Rock, which is another cockroach that shows up, kind of like stage 1, but more serious than that. And notice how we get into some of the events get bunched together and then they spread out and then they get bunched together and spread out. That is absolutely normal. Nothing ever goes in a straight line. You get these periods, and if you remember the 2008 crisis, this is exactly how it felt. You get these periods where there's a burst of activity. It's like, oh my God, the world seems to be ending, which is confirmation of behavioral changes. And then it seems to go quiet. And so you really have to be on your toes, analyzing what's going on behind the scenes. You got to dig into as much information as you possibly can. You got to get yourself covered across as much of the marketplace as possible to decipher signals and how they might fit into what we're talking about here, the progression and processes, which I'll get to in just a minute. I'll show you exactly how the markets actually do fit nicely into this map that we've laid out here. So then a big one, stage 2, absolute confirmation for stage 2. Citibank, Bank of America, and JP Morgan in October of 2007 begin discussing an $80 billion bailout of basically all the SPVs and SIVs that were at the center of the mortgage debacle at the time. So while that was the banking system trying to stand behind it, it also, I mean, $80 billion back in 2007, you got to remember that was this gigantic number. This was something like, holy crap, this is huge. So again, confirmation of the rest of the system. If these 3 large banks feel they have to bail out the SIVs and SPVs to the tune of $80 billion, what does that say about the behavioral changes across the rest of the wholesale marketplace? It said absolutely nothing good, which is why it was consistent with stage 2. Again, you get another bit of a gap there. Things seem to calm down. But then in December, you could tell things were going haywire because the Fed decides to introduce, after talking about inflation risk and stopping its rate cuts after a couple meetings, in December, the Fed comes out with TAF auctions and dollar swaps, overseas dollar swaps, which were more confirmation of these behavioral changes across the global system that told you that things were not moving in the right direction. They were still progressing closer and closer towards stage 3. And to me, stage 3 really started to begin when Citigroup, Bank of America, and JP Morgan abandoned their idea for an $80 billion rescue. Now, at the time, they said it was not needed, and they said that the Fed's TAF auctions would be plenty, and then these banks wouldn't need to put in their own money. But if you understood what they were really saying and reading between the lines, what they're saying is there's no effing way we're going to put $80 billion of our own money or some clients' money into this kind of thing because we have zero confidence that we'll be able to get most of it back. Again, behavioral changes that suggest something big has shifted, another state change into stage 3. Stage 3, we're not just selling an assets. Now we're starting to get toxic waste type of selling. Again, I'll show you that in just a second when we get through the rest of the timeline here. So then the Bank of America takes over Countrywide. They were not really happy about that. Ambac was downgraded, which is another cockroach indication. And that proved to be a big one when we got forward into the second part of the crisis. But still, confirmation, behavioral changes. March of 2008, before we get to March, people forget, over an 8-day period in January, the Fed cut its policy rates in two cases or two instances by accumulating 125 basis points, which is another confirmation that even the Federal Reserve was beginning to panic, which tells you about changes in behavioral and conditions across the marketplace. So Carlyle defaulted and failed on a margin call, which is really collateral call, March of 2008. The Fed created something called, what the hell's the name of TSLF? Basically, it allowed financial participants to swap their crappy collateral with the Fed's treasuries that it held in SOMA. I forget what the TSLF stands for. Treasury Supplement, I don't remember. It doesn't really matter. But what did that tell you about the behavioral and the behavioral changes that led to a change in state and condition of the overall marketplace? As the Fed, for the first time in its history, was doing something like this to make sure that there was top quality collateral, at least try to make sure there was top quality collateral available in the system. Again, alarm bells ringing, behavioral changes, accumulating, a state change in the overall nature of the system. Then, of course, Bear Stearns failed, and that was basically about as good as confirmation you'll get, because Bear Stearns, one of the oldest names on Wall Street, was not a subprime peddler. They were just an investment bank who got wrapped up largely in a collateral shortfall. So behavior, accumulated behavior, telling you that things getting worse and worse and worse along this general progression. And then just after Bear Stearns, the Fed created the primary dealer credit facility. That one I do remember, which was another indication of, if the Fed has to create a liquidity facility so that primary dealers can intermediate on lesser quality collateral, what does that tell you about the behavior of the system underlying it? So you can see the progression from one end to the other. It starts out with establishing the error. We get cockroaches, we get some indications, some downgrades, that kind of thing. Then it gets more serious, which tells you the behavior of the system has shifted. The state, the condition of the system has changed to something more serious and more dangerous, which leads to a higher probability of going even further in that direction, reaching stage 3, which we did get to. Stage 3, an accumulation of behavioral changes to tell you the state of the system gotten even worse, which meant the increasingly worst case scenario and worst case crisis implications and consequences. By the time you get to Bear Stearns, that was really it. There was no coming back from that, even though there was a pause in between, and even though the officials around the world were relatively sanguine and confident that Bear Stearns would be the end of it. This is another one of the reasons I'm bringing this up, and I wanted to focus on this because they should have known better. If you had followed this progression, you would have known that that was not the end of it, that we didn't just avoid the worst case scenario. We were in the progression heading right to and reaching the worst case scenario. And as I mentioned, you can see these state changes mapped out in the behavior of markets as well. It's not just about scanning headlines and seeing what develops out of them. You can also see how the market is responding to conditions in the system that correspond with everything that we just went over in the timeline. I'm just showing you here just junk credit spreads, just a generic sort of proxy for risk-taking behavior that corresponds exactly with the overall progression down towards stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. At each interval, it gets more and more serious. So you see an accumulation of behavior that suggests, okay, there's an error taking place. By the middle part of 2007, the market starts to respond. By the stage 2, the market responds even more. And by stage 3, the market is in full-blown panic mode, or very close to it. It actually panicked even more in September 2008. But even January, February, March of 2008, full-blown panic mode, which is consistent with the progression, the change in state of the credit cycle, as well as the condition across the monetary system and the banking sector from one to the next, to the next, to the next. Another one, this one I got to apologize because the chart is not a good one. I actually have somewhere in my files all the old data on ABX tranches and ABX indexes because they were central to the 2008 crisis. We're not going to get into that here. But it really, as you can see, just like the credit spreads, these are some of the worst vintages for ABX, which goes to show exactly what I mean. We get to stage 2. Stage 1, the error gets established, but you don't see the heavy selling because mostly everybody tries to stand behind the system, which really differentiates stage 1 from stage 2. Then you see the selling begin right around late July, early August of 2007, suggesting behavioral changes, change in state, where it's becoming not just a theoretical issue, a theoretical downside. It becomes something very real. The market responds to it. Credit spreads start to blow out. In this case, the ABX indexes start to blow up. And then you get further along in the progress and you see more and more response from the marketplace that corresponds with the behavioral signals that we're getting in all these developments. And you can start to put together a comprehensive roadmap, a comprehensive picture of where everything stands. It's not perfect. Let me make sure I make that point. It's not a perfect exercise by any means. Like I said, it's a general framework and conception that you can use and apply to begin understanding to get a good enough sense of where things might be today, how it got there, and therefore start to develop a set of scenarios and probabilities for where everything will go after them. So using this roadmap, you can see how we mapped out the first stage of the 2008 crisis, and it fits with exactly what we're talking about. And notice what we don't have here in anywhere. What we don't have are subprime credit losses, because this isn't about credit losses. It's about behavioral changes and reactions. So we get behavioral changes, Stage one, accumulation of those that say there's a state change. We get more behavioral changes that look different than stage one, tells you we're in a different state, stage two. And you get even more extreme behavioral changes that tell you something big has changed, and you get to stage three. And it was, I mean, not to give the guy too much credit, but Ben Bernanke essentially said the same things that I just did to the FCIC in 2010, only nobody heard them because everybody wanted to hear subprime mortgages. They wanted to hear subprime mortgages were to blame and that QE had fixed everything. What he said in 2010, in addition to the quote that I started out with, that subprime mortgage losses by themselves were nowhere near enough to tackle the, to explain the 2008 crisis itself, he's talking about behavioral changes. IKB, I brought that up before. Commercial paper investors began to pull back on IKB because they weren't sure what IKB held, even though IKB did not have any subprime related assets in its fund. So behavioral change, that was a signal. Something had shifted in the marketplace thinking and marketplace action, a behavioral change that when they accumulate, when you see all these behavioral changes accumulate, that tells you there's a state change. That wasn't the only one. As Bernanke again said in 2010, when it gets to a certain point, investors stop actually trying to dig into details. They just say, screw it, I'm going to take my money and go home, which should sound very familiar to everything that we've been experiencing over the last 6 months or so, really 5 or 4 months, where we see hedge fund investors running for the hills. They're doing the same exact thing today that we saw back in 2007, which was a signal of behavioral changes that confirmed the condition in the system had changed. There was a state change from the bubble behavior and bubble activity to something worse than bubble. In fact, this was a confirmation of stage two. So even though subprime mortgages were not huge, they weren't really a big part of the system, it got to the point where the error of the bubble had changed thinking and changed behavior so much that there really was no differentiating between subprime mortgages and other kinds of mortgages. That's how far the behavioral shift had shifted, leading to the state change. So even though you didn't have lenders who were overly exposed to toxic waste as people understood it, subprime mortgages, more parts of the system were considered to be toxic waste simply because behaviors and perceptions had changed so drastically. And that's really the state change that I'm talking about. And there's just any number of examples. I mean, we could go through Ben Bernanke's testimony. He basically roadmapped the entire 2007 crisis, though, like I said, it was clear he didn't really understand exactly what he was talking about. But the basics of it are recognizable because the basics we're talking about here, you can find them in every single bubble cycle in human history because human nature is really at issue here. So again, leverage loans. Even though they were not large by themselves, as he said, they damaged the confidence of short-term investors and consequently, money markets. The entire system began to change. The state changed across the entire system because of these behavioral shifts. And what did the Fed do during this entire time? The Fed does what the Fed really does, which is try to become a distraction. Not actually fixing anything because the Fed doesn't have the ability to fix things. What the Fed is just they try to get the focus on all of their monetary programs, their bank reserves at the time, you know, the PDCF and the TSLF and the TAF and overseas dollar swaps, which is just a distraction to try to get people to believe the Fed is an actual central bank and therefore it has the ability to stop a crisis before it really gets going, when what the 2008 crisis did, among other things, was prove the Fed isn't actually a central bank and it doesn't have the ability to act like a central bank should, or act in the way that most people conceive of with a central bank. But that doesn't stop the Fed from trying to put itself in the middle of everything because, I mean, in one sense, what else are they going to do? You got to try to distract people from the state changes that are taking place and the progression from one end to the other. That doesn't mean we have to fall for it. In fact, our whole point here is to put together this roadmap so that we don't follow the roadmap that the Fed lays out for us. We can actually follow the evidence and corroboration and understand what it means and how to interpret and how to decipher it, which is what we do here at Eurodollar University. We're deciphering information and putting it into a relatively coherent package and framework that allows us to analyze what's taking place and where we think this is going. Like I said, I did this in 2008 as it was unfolding. I really wish I had, I mean, we're all dumber when we're younger. That was almost 20 years ago. But I was doing this in real time in 2008, trying to make sense of how we went from subprime was contained. And to be honest, I sort of believe Ben Bernanke when he said it in February 2000 or March of 2007. You could see that there was a lot of stuff going wrong, but you thought, okay, maybe Bernanke knows better than anyone else. That was the reputation. But it became clear from March of 2007, really through the middle of 2007, that subprime wasn't the issue. It's not that it wasn't contained, it wasn't the issue. So how do we get from subprime is contained, nobody has ever heard of subprime before, to a massive meltdown where basically almost any financial asset that has anything to do with any mortgage is treated as toxic waste, to then the Federal Reserve making money off of the crisis afterward? And the answer is simply behavioral changes and state changes in the functioning of the system, which lead from one to the next, to the next, to the next. And all the way, by the way, there's a state change on the other side of it that leads to a recovery, or what's supposed to be a recovery, at least the end of the crisis, which is how the Fed actually made money. So it wasn't about conspiracy theories. It's about the Fed not really grasping the full implications of the system as it changed from one state to the next state, to the next state, and then the final state. The Fed didn't see it, even though it saw the details. It didn't fully comprehend that process as it was ongoing. And not many people actually did, because it was very difficult to see it at the time, given the recency bias, as well as all the other biases that we still have to this day. Oh, the Fed knows what it's talking about. You got to listen to Alan Greenspan and Jay Powell, or not Jay Powell, Ben Bernanke, Jay Powell these days. But if you saw what was taking place and really put it together, even if you didn't have the specific framework in mind, you could see the progression. You could see the state of the system changing from the way it was before up until around 2006, 2007. And then it changed in 2007, in the first part of 2007. And then it changed again in the second part of 2007. And then it changed again in the early part of 2008. And by then there was no going back. And I do want to pause here to mention one of the other reasons we go through this progression and try to identify these consistent stages, or these various stages, is because there are off-ramps. You don't just go from stage 1 to stage 3. That's not how this works. There are off-ramps. And when you apply this model to past crises that didn't lead to monetary and financial panics, you can see that there are various off-ramps. So while you're looking for behavioral changes going further down the progression, you also have to look for behavioral changes that suggest things are getting better. Maybe the next state change will be from, say, stage 2 of the downswing to stage 1 of the recover, stage 1 of getting out of the crisis. So as you're going through this progression and analyzing behavioral changes and trying to get confirmation of those behavioral changes, or what you think are behavioral changes, there's always, Bayesian probability. It could go one way or it could go the other way. Though the further you go in these stages and further you go in this progression, the chances of finding an off-ramp do diminish, which is another benefit of going through this entire exercise. So while the Fed misread the 2008 crisis, all the information was there. It was there from the very beginning. What was missing was the ability of most people to be able to comprehend, decipher these signals and put them together in a coherent framework, which is what we're doing here today. Like I said, there's another state change on the other side of it you always have to be aware of. Okay, so that's the 2008 crisis. That's behavioral changes. That's state changes. That's validating our model using the 2008 crisis as evidence for it. Let's look ahead here. Let's talk about where we are today. We'll do a little bit of review for people who don't know what shadow banks are, because let's face it, economics does such a horrible job of educating the public. Most people don't know what a shadow bank is, and there's through no fault of their own. They don't know what most of the stuff is because it's never talked about. Everything is just, hey, let's defer to Jay Powell or Ben Bernanke, not really Janet Yellen, but let's defer to the Fed and everything that comes up. We'll go through a private credit hypothetical too, because I want to drill down on something that actually happened a couple of weeks ago. Or was it last week? No, 2 weeks ago. It happened a couple of weeks ago that I think is an important behavioral change that could lead to confirmation of a state change. So I'm going to go through what that means in just a second here. But as always, we're looking for market cues and market clues that either validate or, that confirm what we think is taking place or maybe go in the other direction. We're also looking at systemic cues and systemic clues. And what I mean by those, the various esoteric data sources that we watch here at Eurodollar University that tell us something about the behavioral conditions and behavioral changes from deep inside the monetary system itself. Because not only does that impact the state of the system, it also gives us a ton of information about what all this means. Remember, what we're looking for We're in a situation like this, we're looking for behavioral changes that when they accumulate, give us a confirmation that the state of the system has shifted from where it was before to something else moving forward. So what are shadow banks? Well, first of all, you got to understand the 2008 crisis was not, we never recovered from it. QE didn't do anything. QE certainly didn't fix the banking system. And as you can see here, in 2008, banks got way off track and never got back on track. So that's, the silent depression right here in a chart. And you can see the corresponding one in GDP output basically anywhere around the world. It's the same chart everywhere. I mean, I often show the IMF charts on global trade and global GDP. It looks the same thing as you're looking at here. But as far as shadow banks and the rise of shadow banks, there's opportunity in there, because in the change in trend after 2008, the regulated banking sector, not just in the United States, but around the rest of the world, began to prefer safe and liquid. They bought tons of government bonds. They held Fed bank reserves because why not? Fed bank reserves are safe and liquid. So you have government bonds and Fed bank reserves. Don't want to lend to anybody's risky, just like in the 1930s. Interest rates on U.S. treasuries go way down. Interest rates on riskier borrowers are basically infinity because nobody will lend to them. But not all risky borrowers are, should be shunned by the system. There are some risky borrowers who are good opportunities. So shadow banks essentially arose in the out of that opportunity that the regular banking system, the pendulum swung way too far in the other direction. They didn't want to take any risk. And so shadow banks arose to fill in that gap, because not only does the economy need credit and lending to those parts of the economy. In fact, that's where a lot of economic growth and potential comes from, smaller and medium-sized businesses that the banks wouldn't touch. Shadow bankers started to touch them. They said, look, there's opportunity here, good opportunity here. And by shadow bankers, I mean the technical term that the Fed and the ECB and authorities use is non-depository financial institution. And it's actually a fitting term, because what it means is these are financial institutions. They are businesses that are specifically set up to lend to other people. The difference being between them and a bank is that they can't create deposit liabilities. They don't take in deposits of cash or ledger money from the public. Instead, they fund their relending activities by borrowing from the regular banking system, by getting equity investments from hedge fund investors or institutions. They lever up in wholesale markets like repo. So they're essentially banks, except they don't have the ability to create money and create deposits. But they do the same things that banks do: maturity transformation, lending to the economy, with the specific difference in this case, they are lending to the riskier parts of the credit system that banks don't want to touch, because banks are still scarred and impaired from the 2008 crisis, because QE did not ever actually work. And some of the, you've probably heard most of the shadow banks, the alternative asset management space, there's another name for it. Direct lending is another name for it. Private credit. There's a bunch of names out there. They all really mean basically the same thing. So it's, Rocket in the mortgage space, you got Apollo, BlackRock, Blackstone, Blue Owl. Of course, these are names that we're now familiar with because of, well, for all the wrong reasons the reason we're talking about this to begin with. And you can see where this is going, or where this came from to where it is today. What started out as a relatively good idea to try to fill a market opportunity and fill a market void in the credit system. As anything with Wall Street, it ends up going too far, especially in the 2020s. People starting to believe that the government had engineered the way out of the COVID lockdowns and therefore created a permanent plateau of prosperity. This booming inflationary economy that everybody's talking about in 2021, our shadow bankers went absolutely crazy. And then when the regular banks initially joined with them, started to step back after the banking crisis in 2023, the shadow bankers went even more crazy. And so that's where it really started to turn from something that was useful and necessary to try to get the credit market functioning again, the way it hadn't since 2008. It turned into the error, the bubble, the imbalance, and all the negatives that you can think of to describe what was truly a credit bubble, the error, as I said. And we can see number of statistics that point to what I just said. Shadow banks going crazy. We don't have a lot of direct insight into them, because that's one reason why they're called shadow banks. I'll point out here the reclassification of loans by the H8 statistics with the Federal Reserve. What's important about it, what it tells you is that the Fed was having enormous difficulty keeping track of what shadow banks were doing and how much relending shadow banks were doing into the credit marketplace. So we're already starting behind the 8 ball, so to speak, with the information asymmetry, because again, it's deeper in the shadows, in the same way that most of the mortgage stuff we just talked about in 2007, 2008 was also deep in the shadow. I mean, nobody had ever heard of SIVs and commercial paper and all that funky stuff back then. Similar problems here. We've got a somewhat relatively, I mean, it's not really, shadow banks aren't new, but the way they were used was certainly new. So we had this relatively new phenomena that really took hold in the 2020s, and then the Federal Reserve showing how difficult it was to keep track of what the activities and the volumes and the degree to which shadow banks were really making the same mistakes and errors that subprime mortgage and all the mortgage bubble stuff that went on in 2007, 2008. But with that increasing amount of activity, that was the error. And so the first state change that we've been talking about really since Tricolor last year, establishing the error, establishing that it was a mistake, establishing that there will be more cockroaches, that people did dumb things, as Diamond said, or that there was garbage lending across all of these shadow bankers, which is why we keep hearing more and more people talking about 2008 perils. Again, not the same thing, but the same general process. And that you're going to see we're going down the same general road when we start applying our map. So stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3, we're looking for confirmation of behavioral changes and state changes as we go along here. But stage 1, as we said before, doesn't just, stage 1 is not a discrete period. It blends in with stage 2, that kind of blends together with stage 3, but we're looking for clues of behavioral changes. So let me do a hypothetical here. This is something that came up, a couple of different things that came up recently, one last week and the one the week before. To give you an example, a concrete example, even if it's a hypothetical, of what I mean about significant behavioral changes that we need to be really aware of. So let's start with FSKKR. This is the fund that was in all the news, what was it, a couple of days ago? Was it last week? A couple of days. They kind of blend together when you get really deep into this stuff. You really do need to keep track. But KKR is not the fund owner. They're just a manager co-manager along with FS. The fund was downgraded by Moody's, which to me was also a signal, a sign, a confirmation of behavioral changes. But let's just assume FSKKR here experienced withdrawals, which we know it did. So that's already a behavioral change, something, hedge fund investors who had their money in KKR's fund said, we're going to need our money back. So that's already a behavioral change in itself. That's not the one I want to focus on. Something else here, something more important. In its downgrade, and yes, the downgrade is also a confirmation of a behavioral shift because now we have a ratings agency that's downgrading the fund, but that's not what I focus on here either. In its downgrade, Moody's said, one of the reasons why it didn't downgrade KKR, this fund, to junk was that because it believes it not only has a relatively well-constructed ladder of liabilities into the future that it believes will be able to handle any outflows and withdrawals. The fund also has, as you see here on the screen, sufficient available revolver capacity, which simply means, as we talked about with stage 1 behavior, the ability of these funds who are experiencing withdrawals from their investors to go to the regular banking system and say, I need some emergency cash because my hedge fund investors or my institutional investors got cold feet and they took a bunch of money out. So the ability of funds to draw on these revolving lines from the banking system is one key element that keeps stage 1 from becoming stage 2. So let's assume here that the revolver is provided by just JP Morgan. I mean, it's not going to be a single bank. Most of the time, these are syndicated revolving loans and the receivables get split up into leveraged loans and other types of products. Well, let's just assume it's JP Morgan, just for the sake of our hypothetical. Well, what did JP Morgan do last week or the week before, relatively recently? One of the most important signals that we got yet. JP Morgan announced that it was going to write down the value of collateral. And that was huge. It was huge and underappreciated, if not completely unappreciated, because of what it actually meant about a behavioral change, at least on an individual level. What it said was not that JP Morgan had conducted a collateral call. In fact, what JP Morgan said is it didn't trigger any collateral calls at all. They changed the valuations and valuation technique on certain collateral, which meant that JP Morgan could then deny requests from shadow banks that might say, I want to draw down on the revolving line. So KKR, in a hypothetical example that has a revolving credit line with JP Morgan, these revolving credit lines are not unsecured. You got to believe me. They are secured with some form of collateral. So if KKR needed to draw down on the revolver from JP Morgan to pay back some of its investor withdrawals, it would have to put up some collateral. So what JP Morgan did was narrow the list of acceptable collateral that it will take in order to allow KKR to access that revolving credit line. Effectively, if KKR doesn't have the capital or doesn't have the collateral, effectively shutting KKR off of that revolving line. Even though it has, contractual obligation to give this revolving credit line, it also has the protection in that revolving to say, I have the ability to specify what collateral I'll take. So in other words, what JP Morgan did by revaluing collateral was absolutely huge, because it allowed them to start to say no to these shadow banks that might come to JP Morgan and say, I'm experiencing withdrawals. I need some friggin' money here or I'm going to be out of business. And JP Morgan is essentially distancing itself from the shadow banking problem and using collateral revaluation as a legitimate, but also an excuse, a legitimate excuse. And that is absolutely huge, because it suggests a behavioral change, at the very least, at one of the most important banks that are out there. So JP Morgan was saying before, where our credit lines are open, our revolvers that we've already established, you can draw down on them. Now something changed. Something changed with JP Morgan. Their behavior shifted to the point that they can start denying requests for these various firms, these various shadow banks, to access revolving emergency funds that these shadow banks thought that they could access. That is absolutely enormous. As an example, one important example, but one example of a key behavioral change. And if JP Morgan is joined by a whole bunch more who do the same thing, then you have an accumulation of behavioral changes across the dealer system, the money dealer system, that tells you the state of that system must have changed from where it was before, where the bank's standing behind shadow banks, to where it would be then not standing behind the shadow banks. And in that other state, that second state, that would raise the chances that KKR would have to start selling their assets. So you have a behavioral change that suggests a change in state of the system that leads to damaging consequences, potentially damaging consequences. So if we get to a point where we have an accumulation of these behaviors, the damaging consequences are going to be almost inevitable. So JP Morgan says, I'm going to distance myself from shadow banks, start to step back, leading KKR, in our hypothetical example here, to have to start to sell assets, or at least contemplating selling assets, and probably have to sell a lot more if they can't get revolving credit from someplace else. That's what I mean by a concrete example of behavioral changes. And it is absolutely a big one. We see it from JP Morgan, and we start to see it in more and more places. That's going to tell you, that's going to confirm for you the change of the state of the system has changed to something else, and that something else carries with it more negative, more concerning, more ultimately damaging consequences. That's what we're after here. That's what we're really trying to do. We're trying to make sense of all the stuff that's going on, sorting it out and filtering it through the lens of these behavioral changes and state changes. So that's a hypothetical example. And if you get to the state change, like I said, that's where you see the more negative, the higher probabilities of getting the more negative consequences, and even potentially the worst case scenario. It's exactly the kind of stuff that Ben Bernanke was talking about in his 2010 testimony to the FCIC. He just, again, didn't realize it at the time, nor did he realize the full weight of the implications of what he was describing to the authorities that were trying to investigate the crisis that the FCIC eventually said, oh yeah, it was subprime mortgages. He even told them it wasn't subprime mortgages, yet they whitewashed the crisis anyway, because that's what the FCIC was set up to do. Let's be honest about everything here. So like I said, we don't need to follow the mainstream. We got our own framework to follow that gives us at least a much better opportunity of understanding where things are, how they got here, and maybe more likely where things are going. And it's not just, again, we're not just wedded to a timeline. We're looking for signals and information and confirmation for wherever we can possibly get them. Okay, sticking with our FSKKR example, can you spot the state change on the chart here? It sticks out. It is absolute confirmation of a change in behavior across the stock marketplace that agrees with everything we just went through with the various stages 1, 2, and 3. So we get stage 1 confirmation from the stock market. It's right before the state change. Nobody cared about junk assets because, let's face it, KKR has a bunch of junk assets. In fact, that was one of the terms that Moody's used when they downgraded it. But after July, all of a sudden we care about junk assets. There's a state change right there. So in the stock market, we have the stock market and stock market investors saying, something has shifted. Behavior of the stock market has changed in how it perceives and acts on private credit and these publicly traded private credit funds. And it's not just KKR. I mean, we went over basically all of them. They all look the same thing. So you can see a state change and change in behavior, even in something like stock market prices of BDCs or private asset managers. I'll go through a couple of them as we go forward here, though. Don't really want to spend a whole lot of time on it because I think at this point it's pretty self-evident. You can see a clear evidence of a state change in the stock market, how it applies to the credit market. In that first state change, it was establishing the errors. It was establishing awareness of the errors. And what I mean by that, let's go through the timeline here that we've had up until from last summer to today. So same kind of timeline as it did back in the 2008 exercise. And it really did start with payrolls back in early August. I told you guys at the time, I said it at the time, this is going to be huge. Negative payrolls changed everything. Not because it represented a NBR style recession in the economy, but because it shattered the illusion. It revealed the error as it pertained to the macroeconomic background behind all of this private credit stuff and private credit questions and developments. The negative payroll said, Jay Powell cannot possibly be right. This mainstream narrative of a strong and resilient economy cannot possibly be right. And then we got one negative payroll, then there was another, and every time they were dismissed and downplayed. Again, the mainstream goes in one direction, when instead it was more confirmation that fits with the timeline that suggested the state of the system was changing. And what we're seeing in the reaction in private credit was confirmation that behaviors were changing, of becoming more and more aware of the prior errors in macroeconomic interpretation, as well as when we started getting cockroaches, the errors in the bubble itself. As we saw with Tricolor and First Brands, and then there was Jamie Dimon and his cockroaches. We have PrimaLend and Voice Bridge and Renovo. Bankruptcy. Just like the bankruptcies in early 2007, they revealed the error. That's why the behavior started to change, because it was concrete proof and evidence that there was indeed a lot of stupidity that took place in the years before late 2025. Garbage lending, as Gunlat called it. So it was establishing the error through both negative payrolls, the macroeconomic background, as well as the lack of underwriting and any due diligence of anyone out there in Wall Street, which only compounds the problems and the behavioral changes, because it's one thing when you're lending to a bunch of people you probably shouldn't lend to. It's another thing when you do that, but also don't do the basics of underwriting. You don't even check any of the collateral that you're supposed to have, a collateral protection. So it revealed the error, and the accumulation of errors, or the accumulation of revelations, started to alter people's behavior, and it started to become something like hedge funds and hedge fund withdrawals. More confirmation of behavioral changes in the credit markets in response to these inputs, the revelation of errors, as well as the state of the macroeconomy. Blue Owl's merger. That was important because it wasn't a behavioral change on the part of Blue Owl. What it proved was that Blue Owl was responding to a major change in behavior among hedge fund investors. And then there was more of it. And again, notice what I said before, back in 2007. It seemed like for a while there, for almost a couple of months, it was one thing after another, and then it kind of went quiet. December seemed relatively quiet outside of repo, that is. December seemed quiet. January seemed really quiet up until you got to BlackRock, which in the middle part of January announced that they were writing down the asset value, which is, again, the write down of the NAV for that one particular fund, which was almost 20%, confirmation of the error, state change. Then we get into February, and now we're starting to see not just changes in behavior, but changes in behavior. That was Blue Owl when it announced that it was forced to sell some assets through secondary market sales, which is a whole other discussion, which you probably have, which I have had at our deep dive analysis. Secondary sale, like I said, that's a whole other, we don't need to digress into that. But not only did we get sales from Blue Owl, we also got them for the first time closing off redemptions. Another change in behavior that suggested conditions were shifting within the system, a possible state shift in the credit markets. Then we got more. New Mountain was selling through a secondary market sale and arrangement. Jamie Dimon, I keep bringing him up, but I mean, this is why, because it seems like he has inside information. And every time the guy says utters another quip, we probably should pay attention because he seems to be like he's responding to something. MFS, another cockroach. Even though that was more stage one type of behavior. I mean, that was stage one showing up in February, late February. Cockroach was confirmation of the error and confirmation of the bubble error being not just inside the US or the US system, but that was in the UK. Same behavior over in the UK, fraud, lack of due diligence, lack of underwriting, all the same stuff, confirmation, behavioral changes. AXA and Allianz, those insurers I pointed out in Europe, distancing themselves from private credit, saying, we're not really sure we want to be involved in this. Blackstone, withdrawals, BlackRock with withdrawals. And then we got a whole bunch of more stuff over the last couple of weeks, seemingly one after another, more confirmation of behavioral changes that therefore confirm the state of the system has shifted even further from stage one towards stage two, with JP Morgan's collateral evaluation potentially being the biggest thing yet. If it's joined by other firms, that would be huge. If it stays as just JP Morgan, then maybe we have an off ramp. Because as I said, we got to keep in mind that there are potential off ramps here for the entire system, though haven't really seen one yet. And here again, you could see what I'm talking about, the timeline. We go back to August. Tricolor really started to show up in August, but bankruptcy in early September. We're almost in April. We're talking about 6 months. 6 months, and it's been one escalation after another with confirmation of behavioral changes that also confirm state changes in the overall functioning of the credit market system. Like I said before, we've got confirmation among market signals. Blue Owl as a asset management company. Again, the stock market's changing behavior. There's Blue Owl, the Blue Owl BDC. We can flip through those. The point of bringing this up is, again, showing you that we need to find confirmation and signals from wherever we can get them, because we don't have a lot of direct insight into what's really taking place. I'm never going to get direct insight, but as I showed you with 2007 and 2008, you don't necessarily need. I mean, we would like it. We'd like to be even more confident about what we think we're seeing in our interpretations than we are. We'd always like even more information. However, it isn't completely necessary to have direct access to exactly what's going on in the cross the shadow markets, because it doesn't exist. You don't have that kind of capacity and capability. So we're going to continue to look and search and scour for information wherever we can get it, even to the stock market. Because if the stock market is changing, is exercising behavioral changes and its relationship and how it feels about the same thing, private credit and BDCs, that's one thing. As I said in the video a couple weeks ago, we've probably exhausted the signals from stock market views of these alternative asset managers like Blue Owl, because, I mean, let's face it, how much lower can Blue Owl go? Well, yes, it can go down to zero, but at this point, with Blue Owl being at a record low, it doesn't really give us any more additional information if it continues to go much lower. So now, looking for other potential signals of state changes and behavioral shifts, we start to look outside of the private credit system and alternative asset managers and shadow banks. Let's talk about regulated banks. Deutsche Bank and Wells Fargo, that's another one. Two big regulated banks who have enormous exposure to private credit. So if we see the stock market changing how it's pricing both of those regulated banks, that's more confirmation of changes in behavior and perceptions as it relates to the private credit bust. Now let's talk about some of the systemic signals. because those are just as important as well, because some of the big consequences from a private credit or any credit cycle downturn are going to be when you get to the stage 3, especially how much that can turn a credit bust into a credit crisis, into a liquidity crisis. And those are very different things. A credit crisis is where you have losses that need to be taken, a bunch of bad loans that need to be cleaned out, losses need to be assigned throughout the system to people who should have them. They don't always go to where they belong, but we have losses that need to be assigned. And that does create some negative consequences in the real economy. Some maybe banks fail, maybe in this case, shadow banks fail, but it doesn't lead to something like 2008. 2008 was a credit bust that became a credit crisis that turned into a liquidity crisis when it got to stage 3. That was when the state of the system changed so far. It broke down not just, shadow banks themselves or funds themselves, but it started to break down entire markets. Entire markets became illiquid, which led to other problems. It led to the self-reinforcing spiral that everybody associates with 2008. Not subprime mortgages, stage 3 state change. So we want to monitor systemic indications for the same types of things that we just went over. We want to see if there's anything different as far as how primary dealers are reacting and changing. Are there any behavioral changes among dealers and dealer bank balance sheets? Well, there was a big one back last December. Last December, primary dealers began to stack up their holdings of U.S. Treasury coupons and to an extent bills, but primarily U.S. Treasury coupons. As you can see, it was a sizable increase in coupon holdings, which is not a good sign. Whenever primary dealers are increasing their inventories of U.S. Treasury assets, what that means is they're anticipating something negative taking place. Either they're preparing and keeping their balance sheets ready so that they have collateral in their inventories already, or they're preparing to take advantage of a marketplace that becomes more and more illiquid, more and more rigid and inelastic. Therefore, that's a market opportunity for a dealer to charge higher spreads to rent out collateral that you've bought ahead of time. So on its own, by itself, this doesn't necessarily tell us anything other than the fact that there was some kind of behavioral change among U.S. primary dealers. And when you fit that with all the other information that we're getting from all over the rest of the system, that's another potential piece of confirmation of a state of change of the overall system, and not just as it relates to private credit. So that's one to definitely keep an eye on, especially as it moved up. Another one that I've been pointing out really since last summer, the usage of reserve assets among foreign reserve managers. So they hold their U.S. Treasury assets, which are the reserve assets, in custody, not all of them, but a large amount. I mean, talking about $3 trillion thereabouts. So $3 trillion of these reserve assets, U.S. Treasury securities that are held by Federal Reserve Bank of New York in its custody. What happens is when foreign reserve managers are experiencing, when the banks in their local jurisdiction are experiencing dollar problems, quite naturally, these foreign reserve managers and foreign institutions, central banks and finance ministries and governments, when their local banks are experiencing dollar problems, this is why you have reserve assets to begin with. This is why you have U.S. dollar reserve assets, so that you can sell them quickly and easily, take the liquid proceeds and either give them to the banks that are suffering from Eurodollar withdrawal, or at least relend to them on a short-term basis to try to tide them over until the market starts functioning again. So when we see foreign reserve managers begin to use their U.S. treasuries, that tells you that there's a behavioral change there that is significant in what it says about the rest of the functions across the rest of the system. And what we saw from the middle of last summer, really from July, we keep seeing July show up a lot of different places. And that's the big drop here. That's July. And what it said was, among foreign reserve managers, therefore likely responding to and reacting to changes in dollar conditions in their neighborhoods, were starting to use their reserve assets in a way we hadn't seen since March of 2020. So something significant. And on its own, it suggested, okay, behavioral changes in the Eurodollar system out there in the offshore area, and to the point that it changed the behavior of reserve managers. Something significant there that also aligns with the state change that we just talked about with private credit. In the middle of July, something big changed. We see this behavioral change in the way the stock market viewed and priced private credit in these public vehicles of private credit, the way reserve managers were behaving with their reserve assets in response to Eurodollar conditions. And we saw it with primary dealers, the US dollar exchange value. I mean, a whole bunch of signals that suggested there was a state change ongoing at that time. And of course, we know what it was. We just went over it because we have the framework to do so. Another big one. I just went over this yesterday in our deep dive analysis. We took a deep dive into the tick data through the month of January because it had a lot to say. It had a lot to say about changes in behavior and condition. One of the things about the tick data is, as you see here, and what I went over in a deep dive analysis, there's a pretty solid, not a 100% correlation, but there is a very visible correlation between resale activity and U.S. Treasury yields. So we're getting, not only we're getting more signals, we're drawing in more signals and tying them together to make it what we hope is a more comprehensive analysis under the framework that we just sketched out. So when, as I talked about in the deep dive analysis, when U.S. banks are lending cash to offshore counterparties, that's what a resale is. That's a U.S. bank lending cash on a collateralized basis to some offshore borrower. What we see is that when resale activity goes up, it's usually not a good sign. Among other things, U.S. Treasury yields tend to go down. Why? Treasury yields are responding to, in resale markets, probably tightened conditions in wholesale marketplaces, including collateral. Therefore, maybe some higher demand for collateral, but also just flight to safety, higher demand for safe and liquid, lower growth and inflation expectations. When there's more demand for resale activity from U.S. banks as the real lender of last resort in the Eurodollar world, that's not a good. It doesn't say anything good about conditions in the overall economy as well as in the overall system. So there is a very strong relationship between resale activity, therefore behavioral changes in the Eurodollar system, wholesale markets across the Eurodollar area, and U.S. Treasury yields, therefore the U.S. Treasury market itself. So we're getting more signals, broader coverage, and also more confirmation about shifts in behavior. And you can see more recently over the last couple of years, there really is a strong relationship here. Go look at the end of 2024, the artificial high. You got a sudden, by the way, on these charts, just so you know, the resale activity is an inverted scale. So down means more resale activity and up means less resale activity. So look at October, November, December 2024. Suddenly there was a sharp drop down in resale activity, which meant that U.S. banks saw less demand from offshore counterparties after the carry trade was over with in August and September. At the same time, what happened to Treasury yields? While everybody was shouting about Treasury rejection, it was in many ways a reaction to relaxation in conditions after the acute episode of the carry trade blow up that summer. And then once we got into January and February, suddenly a huge increase in resales. Treasury yields turn around and surprise everybody who thought that rates were going to go up into the double digits or something, as they're always talking about. Or what did Jamie Dimon say in 2023? That the Treasury is going to get to 7%. Nope. Resale activity suggested renewed tightness across the Eurodollar market. Something changed as far as behavior, maybe even a change in state in the Eurodollar condition that led to increased demand for U.S. Treasuries, U.S. dollar flight to safety. Same thing throughout last summer. Up until even recently, though, you see there's a little bit of a departure in January. That's not missing. That bar there is not missing. It's right about 2.1 trillion. There was a huge increase in resale activity in January, which is when we started to see more of the private credit system developments take place. So the 2-year had a little bit of a delayed reaction. The 2-year was kind of sideways and higher in January, but it went lower into February. So there's still a consistent relationship there. Same thing with the 10-year. The 10-year backed up in January, but then it went lower in February. So the point I'm making here, though, is you need a broad survey of market data, esoteric data, systemic data, stock market data, scanning the news, understanding the headlines to come up with an idea of when there seems to be changes in the state of conditions for these systems. Another one, the tick, again, going back to tick, I went over the dive analysis. This is not just foreign governments using the U.S. Treasury assets, but private counterparties and private holders of U.S. Treasuries. They also have reserve assets because these are like pension funds and insurance companies overseas that also need U.S. dollar reserve assets at their disposal and at their fingertips. And it is unusual for them to have to use those Treasury assets, those reserve assets, which they did back in late 2024, as we started to develop that deflationary outbreak that became early 2025, that led into March and April. And you can see again, the private credit bust. It seems like there is a change in behavior of private owners of foreign reserve assets U.S. Treasury reserve assets over the last several months, going back to October, the eruption of cockroaches. So confirmation of some kind of behavioral change that goes toward more corroboration of a shift in the state of the system, not just in terms of BDCs and private credit funds themselves. And you can see how relatively rare that has been for the 2020s. It was a little more frequent, the use of the private use of reserve assets during the 2010s and the deflationary episodes back then. But let's finish up here with some real data. I actually did this in our December webinar. I wanted to update this because after everything we went through, I keep saying it's kind of like 2008, but it's not at the size of 2008. People naturally ask the question, okay, we get the processes, we get what we're looking for, but how big of a problem really is this? Is this potential, even though it's not 2008 scale, does this have the potential to lead to some really negative consequences? Not just in terms of, private credit or shadow banks going bust, but what would that mean as far as the stock market? What would that mean as far as other asset classes? What would that mean for jobs and incomes? What would that mean in the real economy? Are we really talking about a sufficient size in the private credit system, the private credit bust, that could lead to maybe not 2008, but something closer to 2008 than, say, something like 2001, or even getting an off-ramp? Because the bigger the garbage pool, as I called it, in the private credit system, the less likely there is to be an off-ramp. Because when you have a bigger problem that shifts further and further in the direction of stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3, down in that direction, the downturn in the credit cycle, the less likely there is the ability to pull out of it before it leads to lasting damage in the real economy, for sure, which is what happened in 2008. In fact, it led to permanent damage across the global economy. And what we see is that the numbers are substantial. Now, these are mostly just kind of back of the envelope calculations because we don't have the ability, we don't have, again, the insight into the system to come up with some solid numbers. I know people put out some estimates, but they're kind of dubious because we don't really have a good insight. So I'm using the financial accounts of the United States, which is prepared by the Federal Reserve. It's the Z1 statistics. And we're measuring the garbage lending. So from late 2020, so really 2021, 22, 23, and 24, and into 25, those are like the 2005, 2006, and 2007 vintages of mortgages back in the former crisis. This is when people were really struggling, but private credit providers didn't care because they were only interested in booking volume, as much volume as they possibly could. So the increase in lending among non-financial, non-corporate business was about $1.5 trillion between the end of 2020 and the end of 2025. So that's already sizable. These are the middle market loans that private banks or private credit providers and shadow banks made their business out of. This is where they really focus. That's where a lot of this direct lending was really. It really went into the middle market part of the corporate business. So you can see $1.5 trillion increase there. Non-financial corporate business loans, liabilities, again, pretty substantial during the garbage period. Not as substantial. We were talking about another $1 trillion. So right away, we're at $2.6 trillion in the corporate part of the marketplace as far as loans. Household loans, not nearly as much, but there's still quite a bit of garbage. And you can see how most of that garbage was in 2021 and 2022, when everybody was still high on the idea that the economy was going to recover, if not boom, forever forward into the future. So household credit, almost $1 trillion there. Not good. Non-financial corporate business, this is corporate bonds. Again, same garbage period. Get into the next couple quarters. There's another almost $1 trillion there. The next one is about financial sector's issues of corporate bonds. This is not necessarily garbage loans. This is more about some of these shadow banks issuing bonds to pay for, to fund their lending activities. And you can see there is a almost $1.3 trillion increase there, which not necessarily related to shadow banks, but it's relevant to the discussion here. So when you add all of these things up, our garbage pool, so we have an increase of $1.5 trillion there, $1.13 trillion there. Consumer credit, almost $1 trillion. Domestic non-financial corporations, non-financial corporate bonds, almost $1 trillion. And by the way, these numbers were revised significantly higher since I went over them back in December. Was it October? I think it was October or December in our webinar then. They were revised significantly higher, which goes to show what I said earlier, that authorities have enormous trouble tracking down just how big the garbage pool is because of the difficulties of having some kind of insight, some reasonable insight into what shadow banks are up to. So our garbage pool, rough outline, our upper bound for the garbage pool is about 4.5 trillion. So yeah, not 2008 big, but not far off of it. Now, of course, not all of that 4.6 trillion is garbage. In fact, the vast majority of it is not garbage. But the point of this entire webinar is that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the losses are, the 4.6 trillion. All that matters is that they're significant enough to lead to changes in behavior and therefore changes in state of the overall system, which, by the way, we have not just seen, I have cataloged them for you right here in this presentation. So yes, 4.6 trillion leaves a more than a sufficient size and scale that it can create the types of problems that we're talking about, where people react negatively to them to the point where it progresses from one state to another to the other. The rest of this is just updating what we did before. Who owns all this garbage? Well, it's spread out across the system, which in many ways is supposed to be positive, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's positive, because what ends up happening is you have an insurance company saying, I don't want anything to do with private credit. Then you've got property investors or property insurance companies saying the same thing, broker dealers and finance companies where all the factoring is. Plus you've got bank funding that's providing some of the funding for all this too. What the point of that is that this is interconnected. It's not like you can just isolate the private credit bubble to one area of the financial system and then leave it there, kind of wall it off and hope it doesn't spill over, or expect that it won't spill over. It is intertwined and interwoven into a lot of things. And when you've got 4.6 trillion, that's just the increase since 2020. 4.6 trillion is a potential garbage pool. The potential for negative consequences really is as significant as it seems to be from everything that we just went over, the behavioral changes and the states in the system. The changing state of the system actually makes more sense than it not changing, or that the system is just ignoring what's going on here because Jay Powell says everything is just fine, or because Blue Owl's management says our fundamentals are strong and solid and our underwriting is unimpeachable. And you just have to continue to laugh the more that the private credit providers themselves try to alleviate everyone's fear. Who's the latest one? John Gray, the president of Blackstone, basically saying, you people don't know what the hell you're talking about. You've never worked in private credit yourself. You couldn't possibly understand what's going on here. Yeah, it's not us. We're reading all of these signals where the system itself is changing its behavior because of there is something there to be worried about. And we haven't even talked about, I'm not even going to go over this. We haven't even talked about the state of the macroeconomy, flat beverage, the oil shock, which the longer this goes, the more pressure it's going to put on everything from the real economy to the private credit bust to begin with. So there are more negative factors that we also need to consider, but I'm running out of time here. Let's wrap this thing up. Remember, we're going to have a question and answer after I'm done, because I know you probably have quite a lot of questions. I've got quite a lot of answers. I got some questions of my own too. We always should have questions. But what we're looking for is behavioral changes that accumulate to suggest, and strongly suggest, if not confirm, the overall state of the credit system, if not monetary system beyond it, has shifted into something different. And something different means the implications and consequences have turned differently. So where we're in the bubble state beforehand, the consequences of being in a bubble state aren't necessarily negative. It means the economy continued to move along, even in a forgot how to grow state, not likely to start to experience some real downside consequences. But if you have a credit system that is shifting from the way it was before to a different set of characteristics, the potential outcomes also shift with that state change. And the more and more behavioral changes that we observe and accumulate together, the more likely it is this situation has shifted sufficiently that it leads to a different set of potential outcomes. And among those different sets of potential outcomes is further state changes, which we continue to have to monitor through these, observations of markets and what they mean as far as behavioral changes that potentially accumulate and suggest another change in state of conditions of the overall economy as well as the financial system. That it means that the implications and potential consequences have likewise shifted further in the same negative direction. That's what we're doing here. That's what we do here at Eurodollar University all the time. Whether I state it explicitly or not, every single YouTube video that I've ever put out, every single deep dive analysis that I've ever written is all about analyzing what state we're in, whether or not we think we're changing state, and what the potential consequences would be to changing a state. And again, like I said before, changing state could also be positive. We could find an off-ramp, and we want to be on top of, if we do find an off-ramp, we want to see the behavioral changes before we get to any kind of confirmation, because that will lead to all sorts of different positive consequences, therefore opportunities as well. And ultimately, that's what we're really trying to do here. From this state analysis, this mapping our states, what we're trying to do is spot not only risks in our investments, but risks in our careers, risks in macroeconomy, risks to politics, as well as opportunities in all of those. That's another thing we talked about Eurodollar University. In fact, that's what we did at Eurodollar University Live last month. We talked about some of the opportunities from the changing states of the credit market cycle and the credit market system. So we adopt this model toward not just, it's not just about good conversation in politics. It's about how do we use this information? First of all, how do we decipher the information, put it into some kind of coherent framework that becomes a workable format so that we can then make informed decisions about what it is we're trying to do. And as you can see, it does fit with real world characteristics because it really is how this system works. It's not one stage and the next stage. It's not subprime mortgages. And as I said in the very beginning here, if nothing else, take this away. It's not the losses that end up killing the system. Not the losses at all. It's the changing state. And so our mission here at Eurodollar University, the logo is more than a black hole. It really is to try to illuminate all these concepts and all of these markets and all of these conditions and all of these functions that nobody else talks about, because we're all taught and conditioned to believe Fed, 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 Fed. And that starts with interest rates. It starts with deciphering what should be very basic signals. And you have to be able to do so in order to make sense of what they're telling you. As Milton Friedman said a very long time ago, the problem with having people understand monetary mechanics and really basic financial literacy is central banks. So we don't need to follow central banks down their road. We can follow our own analysis. We have a framework to do so that we can interpret the evidence as it actually is. And so we have an offer for you to join me in this process here at Eurodollar University. I've got a webinar offer, as I do with every single webinar. Give people access to, first of all, the vast library of material that I have, all the background information about how you can learn to decipher these signals so that you're not the last to know when markets are moving or how markets are behaving. Why are interest rates doing what they're doing? Well, you got to be able to understand what interest rates are at a very basic and fundamental level. That's what we do here at Eurodollar University. You can't understand, as I mentioned before, sitting here in 2008 trying to go through this exact same thought process, but without having all of the dots connected, was an extremely, not only was it time consuming, it was inefficient in many ways. It was kind of unproductive. And I ended up getting the right conclusion anyway, but it would have been a hell of a lot better if I'd been able to do so in the type of framework that we're offering you here for Eurodollar University subscriptions. We tell you what information to follow, what signals mean, what signals you should be looking for. It's really about deciphering information, being able to interpret the world as it is and what it all boils down to. A big part of that is, as you could probably tell here, because human nature is behind everything, we're always looking for patterns because a lot of patterns repeat. We talk about Eurodollar cycles all the time because the Eurodollar cycles are more confirmation that we have the right structure and framework for interpretation. So Eurodollar University, we have subscriptions available to give you all the tools to be able to analyze, decipher, interpret, and keep following along, keep abreast of what's really happening. Because this is the part that really, to be honest, it fucking pisses me off. It pisses me off a lot. Economics, the mainstream, the central banks most of all, they give you all the wrong, not only they give you the wrong idea, almost everything they've told you is completely backward. Starting with, earlier in the webinar, we talked about how the Fed is a distraction. The Fed is a purposeful distraction. They tell you interest rates that go lower are stimulus. Bullshit. Interest rates go lower are not stimulus, and history shows conclusively that's not the case. In fact, I just did a deep dive analysis about this last week. that rate hikes are one of the reasons we had the credit bubble to begin with. Let me say that again, because everybody has been conditioned to believe that the Fed lowering rates is how we get the bubbles. No, 2008, same thing. The worst parts of the credit bubbles came during the rate hikes. You want to understand what that means and what I'm talking about here and what the evidence actually says. That's what Eurodollar University is for. You get the wrong idea about how the system works so that everybody is often confused. And by the time you figure it out, it's already too late. And this is the stuff you just don't get anywhere else because nobody else is doing it. They don't even know where to look at it. The problem I have a lot of financial services, and yes, there's a lot of good people in financial services. I've worked with a ton of good people in financial services who really do want to do best by their clients. But one of the problems is financial services, especially the Wall Street institutional end of things, is not really set up for processing information in reality. It's more about just following the curve and following the herd. So we are swimming against the tide, and we're doing so specifically because the tide is going in the wrong direction most often, most of the time. So we give you the framework, everything that's going on. You know, for your serious investor, if you're a serious scholar, you just want to know what's taking place. We use this framework. We use this roadmap. Even if I don't say so explicitly, what we're always trying to do is interpret signals and information to decipher what stage are we in, what state are we in, the state the system is in, is it changing, are we seeing behavioral shifts, that kind of stuff, and knowing where to look for it. So what you get from a Eurodollar University subscription is a ton. I spend 12 hours a day putting together daily deep dive analysis, which are 2,500 to 3,000 word essays on what's the most important topic going on right now. Like I said, yesterday, I wanted to deep dive over the tick data because there was a lot of good stuff in there. A lot of information people don't know is there, and they don't know how to use it even if they do know it's there. The tick data had a lot of good confirmation signals. As I showed you, the relationship between resales and treasury yields. Absolutely useful stuff that people don't know. So I do the deep dive analysis. We have daily briefings. We have a whole library of videos on background material. We've got the basics series. I'm starting a new series called The Conundrum, which is about basics of interest rates and understanding deciphering the signals. And by the way, we're also redoing Eurodollar University, the member section. It's going to become more like a university, so you can start at the beginning and go through what is a coherent curriculum so that by the end of it, you'll be a true Eurodollar University scholar. But it's basically all the materials, everything that you need to understand where we came from, monetary theory, monetary economics, basic economics, what all these signals are, what they mean, and how they all fit together. That's what Eurodollar University is, and there's a lot of material available. We make available to our subscribers. So like I said, deep dive analysis, daily briefings. I do have my personal portfolio allocations as well as a couple of model portfolios that I haven't really changed and updated much because nothing much has changed in the marketplace that makes me want to do things, though I have said my last update on it. We're getting closer, I think, to that time. So there are some investment ideas there. Classroom videos where we go deep into the mechanics here, especially where it comes to circulation of money, because circulation is more important. And why is circulation more important? There's all sorts of material that shows you why that is. We do live Q&As every week. Well, live Q&A every other week. Any of the questions that are left over from our Q&A, I do a recorded Q&A. So you got an opportunity to ask me questions. There are opportunities for Eurodollar University Live, which we're going to do more of. We did our first one last month. We're going to have other ones. All our deep dive analysis subscribers, I offered them a free ticket to join us on the Monday for our deep dive or for our Eurodollar University Live. What else is there? There's presentations. I got tons of presentations that dig into these topics. We got case studies. There's an endless volume, an endless library of material to help you fill in the gaps that are left behind by central banks, the mainstream economists, and everything else. So you got to stay on top of this stuff. Like I said, we have confirmation that the state of the system is changing. We've got the evidence that shows that the private credit bubble itself is significant enough to seriously consider some of the bit more downside consequences. And as the system shifts from one state to the next, the chances of experiencing those downsides goes way up. So you got to stay on top of everything as it's taking place. So what we give you is the ability to not just stay on top of everything, but also at your leisure, go back and understand everything from a ground level building up. So if you want to join me at Eurodollar University, there's a link in the next slide here. Our offer is all this material, $1,200 per year. It's really our lowest price that we've offered really since launching Eurodollar University. It is comprehensive. You get everything. It's also risk-free. Try it out. Look at some of the basics videos. Read our deep dive analysis. Scan through the daily briefings and keep abreast of everything. Join us for a Q&A. There's another one coming up this coming Tuesday, a live one. 14 days. Try out Eurodollar University. I'm pretty confident you're going to like what you find. But if you don't, no questions asked. We'll refund your money. No risk to you. $1,200 for everything. Given what's going on right now, and again, we haven't even talked about the oil shock and what that means. And again, you've got central bankers out there running around with their hair on fire talking about inflation, inflation, inflation. No wonder people are so freaking confused all the time. There's nothing inflationary about an oil shock, and the evidence is conclusive about this. Not only do we talk about the evidence in our deep dive analysis and in our other material, I show you why economists think that oil prices are inflationary. That's another service that we provide here. Why is it that you hear interest rates going down are stimulus? Where does that come from? It actually comes from a very specific part of Eurodollar development. So it's information. It's filling in all the gaps so that you're able to decipher the developments in the world that we have. $1,200 for a subscription, annual subscription. Go to the link that you see on the screen here, eurodollar.university/webinar-offer. Use the code and you get $1,200. Make sure that you hit the yearly option because it's only available for yearly subscriptions. And once you create an account for Eurodollar University, you get to the billing page and you add this code. It will change the price at that point to the $1,200 offer. Then you subscribe and you are almost set to go. You get an email where you have to verify your email. But after that, you're set to go with our DDA and everything else that comes with it. So with that, I think we're going to go to our questions and answers. I'll leave that on the screen for a little bit longer here. But let's start with the Q&A because I know we got a lot of stuff here.
The first thing that a lot of people are actually having issues with were just what you were just talking about, Jeff. You just explained it, but why don't you just walk through it and tell me, how do I actually check out?
Yeah, so when you go to the checkout, you're going to need that code 2026 MAR webinar all. You got to click on the yearly option because it's for a yearly option. It won't work with a monthly option. But when you click sign up, what happens after sign up is you go to a page where you have to create an account. It's a little bit of a clunky system. I do apologize, but this is the system that we have. But you create an account, you put your email in there, you create a password, you confirm the username and confirm the password. And after you create the account, you hit create account, and it takes you to the billing page where you put your credit card information in. That's where you're going to put in the, you got to put the same, you got to confirm your password, Josh.
I'm trying.
Yeah, I know.
This is why it's hard. I actually forget what I put.
Yeah, just put 1, 2, 3, 4, which probably won't work. It's probably a specific number of letters and numbers. But once you get to the billing page, that's where you put your credit card information, and over to the right there, after your credit card information, you put the discount code, and there you see it takes it gives you the discount offer of $1,200 per year. Then you continue, and it charges your card, and you are on your way to Eurodollar University. Again, apologize for the clunky nature of the sign up. But it's relatively easy to use. And once you get into the Eurodollar University website, everything's there for you. Though I will say again, we are busy at work redesigning the site we're actually creating both a browser and a smartphone app that will centralize everything Eurodollar University. It's not ready yet, but it's in the works. So it'll be even easier to use and access everything that we have available.
All right. There's a ton of questions. So let's get into the first one.
Yeah, let's get to it.
The first question is there any way to follow your analysis real time so I don't have to watch every single YouTube video? Well, that's a pretty convenient question.
Well, we know what the answer to that is. You're going to sign up for Eurodollar University. I do put some blog posts up on our Eurodollar University website. So every once in a while, if there's an important topic or important development that comes up, but you're not going to be able to get everything. And yes, I do put a lot of stuff out there because there's a lot of stuff out there to go over. People accuse me of the fire hose approach, but I think that's the best way to do it, because to really stay on top of everything, you really do need to stay on top of everything. So the best way to do it.
Yeah, when someone says they want to see every day, what do you do with the DDA? And what is the DDA?
Well, the deep dive analysis is, like I said, it's a long form breakdown of what something specific topic from the Eurodollar perspective. So yesterday, like I said, we went through the in fact, let me pull it up, Josh. Let me share my screen here. Let me pull up what we did yesterday. Hold on just a second. I'll pull it up so you can see exactly what we're talking about. And I think, it'd be worth it to share some of the insights of what I went over. Let me get back to sharing my screen.
You've been sharing.
Oh, I'm still sharing?
Yep.
Okay.
We can see.
Perfect. So, here's the weekly recap. Here's the other ones. Let's talk about the tick data, for example. So this is a deep dive analysis from yesterday. First of all, we talk about why central bankers are so convinced that oil is inflationary that they keep talking about it endlessly and keep coming up with it endlessly. So went through a couple of details of central bankers and showed, Mr. Dove himself, Stephen Murren, changed his. He became a little bit more hawkish based on some differences between the PCE deflator and CPI. So I explained what's going on there. Why is the CPI looking different than the PCE deflator? What does it mean? But really, it was the tick data, Japanese CPI, which is important because it shows what the central banks are doing over there. But tick data. What was going on in the tick data? We broke down the tick statistics through January, including something big. We're talking about changes in behavior. Here's a big one right here. I got it circled over there. This is banks' own liabilities, U.S. dollar liabilities, banks to offshore firms. This is another proxy for bank activity to and from the Eurodollar world. What you see is that from the last year, but really the last couple of quarters of last year, a change in behavior. And so I broke down exactly what that means. What is this tick data showing us? What is it telling us? And what is the data? How does it fit into the overall framework that we just went over? You can see it clearly in both the quarterly changes as well as the 6-month net changes. There is a very clear change in behavior there, which tells us something important. The stuff that we just went over in the webinar, the resale activity, what resales mean, the lack of treasury bill collateral that's the other side of the resales. I explained that. Where it all fits together, how it fits with treasury yields, why it fits with treasury yields, what those signals are telling us. So, it's a pretty long, it is, like I said, it's a long form video or long form essay, about something important that just came up, whether it's new data, a new development, a new market signal, all of that stuff. That's a deep dive analysis, and there's a lot of it. And this is every single day. Every single day you get a deep DDA up here.
I think everyone is impressed by how much you can possibly work. I know Jen, your wife, probably thinks you're crazy.
Yeah, it is. It's 2 jobs in one. It's actually 3 jobs. There's a lot to do, but it's like I said, the only way you can stay on top of everything is to literally stay on top of everything, because you don't get any sources that you can really trust from the mainstream. I'm kind of stuck having to do everything myself. You can't take any shortcuts here. You can't just depend upon, Jay Powell telling me what to think about interest rates, because I'll get a wrong idea from it. So in order to really stay on top of especially now with everything that's moving and everything that's changing, it really is it's a full-time job, or at least 2 or 3 full-time jobs. I spend at least 12 hours a day putting all the material together.
It's honestly truly commendable. Thank you for everything you do, Jeff. The next question.
It really does piss me off that I have to do this, because I really shouldn't. This should be the job of, economics and economists, but instead they drop the ball so badly. It's become an ideology. And now as an ideology, economists in the mainstream, especially the financial media, are so dogmatic about it. There's absolutely nothing useful in the information that you get. So, if this is what it takes, then this is what I'm going to be. That's what I'm going to do. So let's get some more questions here, Josh.
All right. The next one is, what is the difference between what you share for free versus what your members get direct access to?
Members get a whole ton more.
What's the difference between the YouTube videos you do versus the membership site?
YouTube is not a good medium. It's a decent medium. It's not a great medium for for getting into the type of depth that we really need to understand. We can go over some concepts, but a lot of people, it's more of an introduction. It's not really getting into the nitty gritty details and really fitting things together. It's not the best medium for what really should be a longer run process of understanding. So the Eurodollar subscriptions, we go way, 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 way beyond what we get into on YouTube, because putting together individual videos on specific topics that you could never put on YouTube. Like, doing a basics video on what QT is, what it really is, what bank reserves are. It's not gonna play on YouTube. But to have it available for members who want to refer to it after we talk about a deep dive analysis where we go into the Federal Reserve and it's changing its balance sheet policies and what that means, it is incredibly useful. And I will link to it. So if you're reading a deep dive analysis where we talk about QT or the Fed's balance sheet policy, I'm going to post that video right in the deep dive analysis, so everything is available for you. And as I said, once we get our browser app and our smartphone app up and running, it'll be even easier to put everything together. So the real difference is the level of detail and degree that we can get into in our subscriptions that we just can never do on YouTube. Unfortunately, that's just the way it is. There's just too much material here, and it is too complicated and complex to go to even put together in a 15, 20-minute YouTube video. Even day after day after day, it's tough to satisfy the needs of YouTube along with the desires of those who are really serious about getting into this material. So that's what the Eurodollar University was. That's why I started it, what it's formed for, and what these subscriptions are really all about.
All right. Next question is, what would you tell someone who understands the risks but doesn't really know what to do with their portfolio? So this person's asking for more actionable advice.
Yeah. So there's always two sides of that coin. And this is where you really have to know yourself. It's the first conversation you should ever have with an investment advisor, is to be honest about where you are. Because some people who understand these state changes and where they seem to be heading, the two sides of the coin is, first of all, it's a risk, which means there's downside to the assets you have, but it also creates opportunities to buy assets that you don't have that could potentially be profitable. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is, could you be the second one? Could you actually go into a risky venture on the downside of a credit cycle and buy, say, distressed credit, which is where a lot of money is made? And you got to be honest with yourself. If it's something that's going to keep you up at night, it's not really something you should do. So there are opportunities and risks in everything. It's same thing on if we get through the other state change to the other side of everything, where we get into a recovery, hopefully a recovery, probably not likely, but even just a reflationary period, there are risks and opportunities to that as well. So the first conversation you need to have with yourself, if you're DIY or if you're going to be with an investment advisor, is to be honest with yourself about, they call it risk tolerance. It's not. It's about your own personality and being honest with yourself about your personality. Risk tolerance is really about your personality, like I said. And so understanding that, then it either opens doors or it closes off discussions that you don't necessarily need to have. Like, for example, if you're not willing to take the risk of taking advantage of some of the downside cycle opportunities, which, by the way, there's nothing wrong with that. There's definitely, a valid investment strategy to just preserving capital. If you're going through a recession or a downturn or a crisis or something like that, and you don't want to sit there and sweat out the nitty-gritty details of the downside of the cycle, then just preserve capital and focus on that. The problem with it is you get into issues of timing, and then you're sitting on assets that don't generate much of any return. And if you don't have the timing down, or you're not really on top of the timing, you give up potentially a lot of upside, which leads to all sorts of problems. But again, having an honest conversation with yourself about your personality will lead you in the direction of either avoiding risks or taking opportunities. That's really the first step.
All right, that leads us to, what indicators are you watching right now that tell you we're going from stage 1 credit crisis to stage 2? And then what would it take to get to stage 3?
Yeah, stage 1. Okay, so it starts with the timeline as I put it together. So you can see the events that are taking shape and what they suggest as far as what they're telling you about the behavioral changes inside the system. I mean, the easiest one to understand and see is what hedge fund investors are doing. So when you see all of these big funds like Blackstone, BlackRock, talking about massive withdrawals. And we're talking about 11, double-digit percentages of these multi-$10 billion portfolios. Blackstone's BCRED fund, 80-some billion dollars, the largest private credit fund there is on the planet, getting hit with 11% withdrawals. That tells you something about the behavior of investors, the changing behavior of hedge fund investors, and probably some institutions. These are not just wealthy individuals. They're institutions who are also doing the same thing. So that's already a good place to start. And then you start looking you're looking for more confirmation. So can you align these shifts in behavior and state changes with what you see as far as market signals? The yield curve, the treasury yield curve is a good place to start. It's easy to interpret once you get your head around what it actually tells you. Get outside, unlearn everything you learned in economics and everything the mainstream tells you. But even that, there's a lot of noise in those signals, which is why you're never focusing on one or another. So you have the yield curve, you have derivatives. I mean, we talked about the cross-currency basis recently. Don't want to really get into that here. There's a lot of monetary signals to go in top of market signals, try to get some kind of price discovery. One of the reasons I've relied pretty heavily on stock prices of these private credit funds is because it's one of the few areas of real-time price discovery that we have. It's not perfect. We're talking about the stock market here, but stock market perceptions of private credit conditions is somewhat helpful, especially if it aligns with what we're seeing in the yield curve or repo markets, or we went over in the webinar here what foreign reserve managers are doing with the reserve assets. The fact that they've been using them to such a heavy degree, that is a clear signal of some kind of changing behavior. And the fact that it aligns with everything else that we just talked about is a powerful piece of confirmation. So you want systemic signals, you want market signals, you want data, you want anecdotes, you want basically anything that you can find. And so what am I examining? What am I looking at? All of the above. And it's always, you never want to focus on one thing. You never want to fall in love with either one indicator or even a set of indicators. One of the signals that I always love is the yield curve, but the yield curve has gotten it wrong plenty of times. And by wrong, I mean, it fluctuates. It moves up and down. It's not a dependable signal in every single circumstance at all times. So you look at the yield curve, but you also look at, does the yield curve match up with the volume of everything else that we're following? So again, that's what Eurodollar University is here for. The ability for you to follow signals you didn't even know that you needed to follow. And there's a whole bunch of them. You just keep following as many as you possibly can, as long as you can maintain a mental roadmap and a mental picture of what all of it actually means.
And then when you see one of these signals, where would you put it into where would someone else access it real time?
I put it in the deep dive analysis, talk about it. I mean, one of the things that we're going to do with our Eurodollar University 2.0 is make those signals more available. There'll be something like daily notes that'll come out on some of the signals that we follow. Say, hey, this is flashing. This is doing something that we talked about in our deep dive analysis, kind of connecting those dots. But it really, the deep dive analysis is a good place to start. It's where everything comes up. It's where we put it into the context for you and give you the background information. Our Substack post, our Substack subscription, which is included in the offer that we're getting you here, packages everything into a weekly theme that draws from all of the irrelevant material. So there are various ways for us to keep you on top of everything. If something big changes in the yield curve, you're going to have a post on it. You're going to have probably a YouTube video go along with it. There are going to be background videos that cover what the basics are, what the fundamentals mean. And we'll put all of those things together so that you can have the background material as well as what just happened, and hopefully therefore have a better understanding, not hopefully, have a better understanding of what it means in the context of whatever it is that we're encountering and facing at that moment in time.
All right. This one is, can you see anything that institutional money is doing right now that retail can't see?
As far as, are we talking about the private credit bust? I know we can't go back and forth.
That's all the only thing I see from a question. If we can go to the next one too.
No, that's a good question. It's really, it's kind of two parts to that question. First of all, is there a distinction that's worth exploring? Because I know there's this perception of dumb money versus smart money. And yes, there are occasions where you can see, retail investors doing stupid things, but in many circumstances, the institutions are the dumb money. And credit bubbles tend to be that's where they really stand out. And this is one of the themes I explored in our deep dive analysis on rate hikes being one of the reasons you get to bubbles, is because institutions are pushed into forms of behavioral changes and state changes they wouldn't otherwise do. So I'm not always sure that there's a meaningful distinction between institutions and retail. Instead, I kind of take it, my own view and how I frame everything is that there's separate parts of the same market, and more often than not, there's really not a distinction to explore.
Okay. Let me see. How fast do these credit situations move once they start? Is it daily or weekly, or do you have months to prepare? How would you actually know?
As far as most people's perceptions, these things go very slowly. I mean, just look at the timelines we put together. The timeline for 2007. If we were being fully comprehensive, you wanted to look at the timeline. It really started in early 2005. That's when you got the first couple of signals that suggested, hey, this is not going well. The first inversions were 2005, believe it or not, Eurodollar futures as well as the yield curve. So 2005, you didn't get to Lehman Brothers and what everybody perceives of as the full crisis until September 2008. You're talking 3 years. Even the crisis, the stages, the flip from the downturn, the state change in 2007. So early 2007, it started to get really serious. I went over that, with Fannie and Freddie. Actually, Freddie saying they wouldn't buy subprime mortgages. That's February 2007. That's still a year and a half before you get to Lehman Brothers. It is still more than a year before you get to Bear Stearns. So from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3 was roughly a year. And there's no set timetable here. It doesn't follow a consistent timetable. It doesn't follow a consistent series as far as, how much, stage 1 is exactly 3 months and stage 2 is exactly 4 months and stage 3 is exactly 2 months. That's not how everything goes. Instead, what you have is, it's not a template. That's why we're focusing on the process itself rather than, trying to look at it as a rigid framework that goes specifically and predictably from one to the next along a timeline. So the fact that the 2008 crisis took as long as it did should not have been surprising. I know people have this in mind that it's a very quick event because most people say, the stock market was at its high in October 2007. It was still near its high in the middle of 2008. And then it fell off a cliff seemingly. So from the middle of 2008 until March 2009, really got bad in October 2000. It seemed like a couple of months, but these are processes that play out over more than a year, in some cases, multiple years. We've been talking about forgot how to grow for several years. The private credit bust, this last September kind of started to show up in July and August. So we're already 7 months into this one, and we're just seeing stage 2 behavior show up. There is no clock on this thing, and you got to be prepared for them to be prolonged and protracted affairs. That's one of the downsides or one of the mistakes that a lot of people make. They fall for this idea that if something bad doesn't happen tomorrow, that must mean the chances of something bad happening are diminished because we're talking about private credit. We can see bankruptcies. We can see cockroaches. We can see hedge funds experiencing massive withdrawals, but the system didn't blow up. The system didn't blow up last week. So does that mean the chances of it blowing up are down? Because it sounds like it should blow up. And if it didn't blow up, then it must not go. Maybe it's not going to blow up. You got to understand that these are protracted affairs, and there's a lot of misconceptions about how they go. And I think the biggest one is that they're very quick, they're very fast. Everybody thinks a crash is a multiple day process when it's a prolonged process that plays out over a long period of time.
All right, we do have people asking questions about again how to check out. Can you just run us through again because there's a lot of issues going on?
Yeah, so again, apologize for the nature of the checkout. You can blame Squarespace for this to give them some bad press. So you go to our landing page, eurodollar.university/webinar-offer. You're going to need a discount code. When you scroll down, you got to, copy that, get ready to paste it, click on yearly. And I know it shows you the $2,200 price. It will update when you input the discount code. So then you create their account, which Josh already did and showed you the one time. You put your email address in there, and it's important that you have an email address because that's your ID. That's how the system recognizes you. Then you create a password. You click next, or you click setup, or wherever the action button is, and it brings you to the billing page. Once you get to the billing page, fill in your credit card information, put the discount code over there on the right where it says gift or discount, and then click apply, and it will update to the correct price, which is $1,000 off the list price of $2,200. So $1,200, like I said, is a tremendous bargain for everything that we're offering here. Then you hit continue. It will charge your card. It will send you an email where you have to verify your email address. You have to just click a button. And then after all that, you are ready to go.
All right. We have a lot of people asking, what is going on with the Pringles can, Jeff? They don't understand it.
I got new people here. Pringles. So I don't think it has it on the, this, by the way, came from Don, one of our Eurodollar University Live subscribers and participants. It was a gift, really, really thoughtful gift. Pringles. The old slogan, the old commercial for Pringles is once you pop the top, you can't stop eating. So once you start, you can't stop, essentially. And it was a clever little slogan. And I have applied it as a shorthand to central banks and rate cuts, because central banks do not want to cut rates. And they always say we're going to cut rates a couple of times and then stop. And so where the Pringles analogy comes in is that once they start, they can't stop for a couple of reasons. One, they're usually wrong about the state of the economy. And two, rate cuts don't help. Central bankers assume that rate cuts are stimulus. They tell you endlessly that they're stimulus when they're absolutely not. So they cut rates expecting the rate cuts to help the economy that was struggling, which is why they cut rates to begin with. But like the Pringles can, once they start cutting rates, all they're really doing is recognizing the weakness or whatever it is that's causing the downside. And once they start down that rate cutting, since the rate cuts don't help solve the problem, they're going to cut rates again. They're going to go back in the Pringles can, because once they pop the can, once they pop the top on rate cuts, they will not be able to stop. They'll be able to pause. They'll be able to stretch it out over a longer period of time, because the rate cutting cycles tend to be irregular. They're not regular. People have this impression that they go smoothly on the way up and they go smoothly on the way down. That's not the case at all. So the Pringles is nothing more than my shorthand for how lower interest rates are not stimulus, because, among other things, once central bankers start down that road, they will not be able to stop. All the rate cuts are doing is recognizing that weakness got serious, and they're reacting to it in the only way that they know how. The only tool that they have, other than balance sheet size, which is another form of Pringles, the only real tool that they have is rate cuts. So it's just a shorthand analogy that tells you how interest rates really work and what interest rates really reflect.
The next question was on the gold and silver markets. What's your current outlook on what's happening right now with all the volatility?
Short run, you want to stay away. I think we've seen that. I've said it ever since last year. Gold and silver are going to experience some issues. Silver, because it was up for non-fundamental reasons, supply squeeze, largely related to tariffs that had messed up the supply of silver around the rest of the world, which just creates sort of like whack-a-mole problems. So you have supply shortages show up everywhere. At the same time, let's face it, demand for silver was up because there's a lot of momentum chasers, in addition to people who are buying silver for more fundamental reasons. So silver was destined for a tumble. And we know how markets tend to overshoot on the upside and they tend to overshoot on the downside. So even if you think the fundamental value of silver relative to gold is around $50 per ounce, and you get that from, a gold to silver ratio of, say, 80 as a minimum, probably closer to 90. So gold around $4,500 gives you a silver price target of less than 50 or right around 50. So you expect that maybe there's a downside to 50, but again, markets overshoot on the downside. So I would not be surprised. In fact, I'm expecting silver to go well below $50 at some point. And when it does, that's when you back up the truck and start buying again. Same thing for Bitcoin, by the way. Bitcoin, even though I don't think Bitcoin, in fact, I know Bitcoin will never replace the dollar. It's not a reserve currency, no matter what Mark Moss tells me. Bitcoin has value, and Bitcoin will have, I expect Bitcoin price to rise over time, but it's incredibly volatile. So Bitcoin goes down, it goes below where it is now, 65,000 or 70,000. It gets down to 50,000, 40,000 if it goes lower, because the history of Bitcoin is it goes up and then it goes down by 90%. If you get another 90% drawdown in Bitcoin, you're going to want to buy a ton of that one too. But in the short run, they're going to be incredibly volatile because Bitcoin, in many ways, silver too, are now risk assets. And gold is getting caught up in a couple of different things. I'm a very big believer in gold, obviously. Gold long run, but again, short run, there's going to be a tremendous amount of volatility that's likely to create buying opportunities, probably lower than what the price is today, because it had a really good run last year. Gold did. It's getting caught up in the silver downdraft, as well as I think over the last week, really started last Wednesday. It's getting caught up in liquidations that are being forced on it by same thing we just talked about, reserve managers using reserve assets. We know central bankers have been piling up gold as reserve assets for the last little while. And now they're having, one reason why gold isn't money is that you have to liquidate it into something else to make it useful. It's a store of value and has been a very good store of value, but it still needs to be liquidated. And I think we saw there's a report today about which central bank was it that was liquidating gold? Turkey. Turkey was liquidating gold.
About that. Turkey just sold a bunch of gold.
Yes. So that's the downside of gold, is that when somebody is short of dollars, they got to liquidate a reserve asset, and gold is not a liquid asset to have to liquidate, which pressures prices even more. So long story short, gold fundamentals positive long run, very negative in the short run because of the couple of confluence of events there. Silver, very negative in the short run. See where that goes to the downside. I expect it to overshoot downward because it always does. That's what the markets do. Same thing with Bitcoin. Longer term fundamentals positive, not because it's going to replace the dollar. For other reasons, it's going to be another different store of value, a unique asset that has a lot of upside to it, but a lot of volatility in the short run.
All right. Someone was asking, once the webinar ends tonight in Eurodollar University, what should they be watching? What's the most important thing they should do as a next actionable step?
Next actionable step? We really need to watch. Say that again, Josh.
What should they be doing inside Eurodollar University?
The way to start, and I think the way to really use the service is to start with a deep dive analysis, because that's where we talk about the most important stuff. It's more topical. What's happening today, combined with because it's a long form piece, combined with the background. So if you're really wanting to know what you should stay on top of, that's where you start with a deep dive analysis, and then we will help you and assist you through the pieces themselves about where to look for other information. Whether it's links to previous deep dive analysis that I've written, because I often go back to previous stuff. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, or even 6 months ago. This is what we said. This is what we said to look for. Now I'm referring back to that. As a new subscriber, you're going to look at some of the older stuff. Plus, we're also, if we talk about, like I said before, bank reserves or Fed policy or something else, interest rates. Make sure that you have the membership videos available, or at least know where to go to find those, so that you can dig further into whatever it is that we're talking about that we think is most important at that moment in time.
All right. This guy's asking, what about real estate inside and outside of the US? What are your thoughts?
Real estate, I think, is going to be like the others. I think it's going to be in for a rough ride over the next little while. I mean, U.S. real estate, there's a couple reasons to be apprehensive as a minimum. First of all, the macroeconomic conditions. We haven't really seen a sharp rise in unemployment, and we're already seeing cracks in real estate and even mortgages. That's one of the things I would highly recommend if you're going to buy our subscription. One of the things that you can check out in our DDA site is the presentations that we did at Eurodollar University Live. And there is a presentation there from a fellow by the name of Joe Patag, who is he's the private credit specialist, or not private credit, distressed credit. I can say that right. He runs a distressed credit fund, and what he had to say about the conditions in mortgages and mortgage finance, you are going to want to hear. Lot of information that you don't hear outside the system. This is a multi-decade investor, a guy who has a long career in it. So you put that together with a macroeconomic climate where the real estate market in the U.S. has struggled, and really struggled for the last year, for nothing more than macroeconomic conditions that aren't all that bad. Let's face it. Unemployment is up. Our adjusted unemployment rate's a little bit higher, but it's around, 5-something%. It's certainly not 6, 7, 8, 9%. What happens if we do get there? What happens if we do get a state change, a further state change in the labor market, as I was describing with the beverage curve, that leads to something like 7, 8% of unemployment? What if the oil shock really does end up being like a historical oil shock where it leads to a dramatic increase in unemployment? What is that going to do to real estate? Real estate is already struggling to begin with. So at the very least, just from a macroeconomic standpoint, there's every reason to be careful about real estate here. I'm not saying that you don't go looking for bargains, but maybe be very picky about any opportunities that you have. And then when you combine that with the one thing that we haven't seen in real estate, which is what I just talked about with mortgage finances, real estate's been struggling even though there's been no pressure to sell properties. And I'm talking about commercial real estate as well. Commercial real estate, as we all know, that has never gone anywhere. That's still just sitting there in the background. But nobody has been pressed to sell anything, which is why it just kind of sits there and extends and pretends forever into the future. But as we start to see mortgages and the financial system maybe potentially buckle, you don't even have to break, just buckle a little bit. It could lead to situations where you do get some distressed sales because banks are doing everything they possibly can to not have to sell things. But you get to distressed sales, which leads to depressed prices. And the outlook for real estate is negative and getting more negative all the time for a couple of different reasons. And that's true outside the U.S. too, by the way. It's not just in the U.S. problem. It's outside the U.S. as well.
All right. Next question is, if someone wanted to protect their wealth through this, what's the next best step they can take?
Protect their wealth. Again, it depends. You got to answer the question that I said before is, what is it you're really trying to do and why you're trying to do it? But if you're just talking in very generic terms, the easiest thing that you can do is just buy treasury bills. You can roll over treasury bills completely risk-free. You get a little bit of a return. Right now, you get more return than you did in 2010s, that's for sure. You get a little bit of return. A treasury bill yielding 3.5% is not the end of the world. It's not really that bad. Money market funds that offer decent returns. If the very least, very minimum, you want ease of convenience, it's usable, it's useful. A treasury bill is it's money-like. Treasury bills are so money-like because there's a liquid market. You can sell them at a moment's notice. There's no price movement not really much of a price movement in them. And while you have some risk of the Fed hiking rates and making, a treasury bill briefly go down in price because it's a short-term maturity, it won't actually be that big of a deal. So treasury bills are the easiest way to do it. Money market funds, just leave your funds there. We got nothing really to worry about. You can do other things if you're looking to kind of balance opportunity with downside protection. If you're looking a little bit more aggressively, things like gold. But as we just talked about, gold is especially volatile. Look back at how gold behaved during 2008. If you look at it for the overall crisis, it performed vastly superior to almost every other risky asset for sure. But how it got there was it was up and down with some extreme downdrafts that if you were not there, if you're not fully on board owning gold during 2008, there was some hair-raising, hold your pants months there, especially Bear Stearns and afterward. We can get a whole different story. The PDCF and gold is opportunity with some protection, though incredible amount of volatility. So, there's a lot of different ways you could go to protect yourself. If you're looking a little bit more aggressively, but not as aggressive as gold, you can buy duration on the treasury curve, which means longer-term assets. There is definitely some risk with those. First of all, it depends on what spot on the curve you're looking to get into, because in a bull steepening regime, most of the return is at the front part of the curve rather than the back part of the curve. I think people get that wrong. It's actually in the front part of the curve, which also means there's a little bit more risk to, like we're seeing now, central bank policies and central bank interference. Because if you're owning like the 2-year, for example, the 2-year has a lot of upside in a rates down scenario where the Fed's cutting rates and getting out of the marketplace because it's reacting to weakness. There's a lot of upside in the 2-year price appreciation plus the coupon. However, if the Fed runs into a period where oil prices start to go up, the Fed's going to say it's going to take rate cuts off the table and start talking about rate hikes, which means the 2-year has some downside price volatility to it built in. So you got the 10-year, which is less sensitive to Fed policies and central bank policies, but there's less upside. So it really depends upon what you're trying to do, but there's a number of different ways to play, not taking a whole lot of risk, but also preserving some ability to capture an upside.
All right. What is your prediction for the economy for the rest of the year? What do you think is going to happen?
Never make predictions. Predictions they're invalid as soon as you make them. Always talk about things in probabilities, which I mean, I know some people, it sounds like a cop-out. It sounds like you're just hedging your answer. But the real answer is I have no clue. I don't really know what the unemployment rate's going to be in December any more than anybody else does. I have an idea a range where I think it will be. I'm pretty certain as I possibly can be, which is not 100% certainty by any means. But the chances are the balance of probabilities are unemployment will be significantly higher by the end of the year than it is today. As far as the overall economy, if the unemployment rate's going up, GDP is not going to look good. But I honestly don't care about GDP. GDP is supposed to be a proxy for what we think the conditions in the real economy are, because employment is the most important condition of that economy. This is one of the things that really pisses me off too about economic discourse and macroeconomic discussions is that you've got people walking around saying the economy is good, but the labor market is losing jobs. Those are two different statements. Those are an either or. Those are mutually exclusive. If the labor market is struggling, the economy by definition can't be good. And if there are some economic statistics that say the economy is good, but we're losing jobs, then those statistics are either wrong or they're being misinterpreted, which is usually the latter. So really, as far as probabilities go, because in both the macroeconomy as well as the private credit bust, what has happened over the last several years? What has happened is at every single opportunity where you think there might be an off-ramp from either forgot how to grow or from the private credit bust as it's been developing, instead it only continues to go in the wrong direction, further in the wrong direction, agonizingly slow, but it's moving in the wrong direction nonetheless. We're still in the same cycle. Because that's been the case, because it continues to be the case, and all the evidence suggests that we're still moving in the downswing of the cycle, we're still moving into further stages of the credit bust. We expect the consequences of both of those to continue to build up here in 2026. So not reflationary, more unemployment with all of the consequences that go with it. And as we've been saying from the beginning here, the one leads into the other. This is why the negative payroll reports was such an incredibly important development, because the more stress there is on the labor market, the more that means there's stress among middle market borrowers and middle market company borrowers to begin with, but also consumers. If you don't have a job and you're not worried about your job and you're worried about preserving what income you have, the easiest thing to do is to stop paying whatever debt that you might be paying on. You don't want to do it, but it's the easiest thing to do to start with. I mean, it's a debt that you already got something out of. It's not a current service that you have to turn off, for example. It's easy to just start skipping credit card payments or maybe skipping loan payments. So the higher the unemployment goes, the more stress there's going to be on private credit, which feeds into the negatives of private credit, which feeds back into the real economy. So the chances of getting into some kind of reflationary period to me seem exceedingly small. And therefore, rather than making a prediction, the balance of probabilities that we'll continue to see the same types of behaviors, the same developments that we have over the last several years, and for private credit over the last 6 months, for the rest of this year at the very least.
This kind of ties into it. What opportunities would you like to see? And then how would you want to express that bet in the next 12 months?
Well, like I said, I talked about a couple more already, like silver and gold and Bitcoin. Bitcoin, I think what happens there is as we get further down the road of a private credit bust, because Bitcoin is essentially a risk proxy, obviously risk falls off the table. Therefore, Bitcoin will present a tremendous opportunity on the upside if it continues to go lower. So that's one that you want to watch. Silver's another one. Fundamentally, silver's in a good shape, just not at the price that it's at today. So silver, if it continues to go lower, and I expect that it would, that would be an opportunity. There's opportunities we just talked about more defensively in duration on the yield curve. but you got to be careful with that. But there's risk with everything that you do. There's opportunity on the yield curve. There's opportunity in the downside of the credit cycle itself. I keep talking about distressed credit because historically speaking, distressed credit in an environment that is truly distressed is the best performing asset class. This is, how some people have ridden distressed credit to generational wealth or whatever they call it. That's how you get there. But that's one of those that you have to be absolutely prepared for, because it's not just catching a falling knife, you're catching an entire kitchen drawer full of falling knives. So you got to be on your toes with that one. But there are opportunities in every climate, in every condition, in every cycle. It's just a matter of whether or not you're really up to really pursuing them, and really whether or not you can spot them, whether or not you can do them, whether or not you can handle them.
All right, we have two more questions, but one of the last ones is, what do you think the biggest benefit of Eurodollar University is in everything that you're doing?
Like I said, it's being able to decipher information that you otherwise won't be able to, and do so at a level and to a degree that, look, it's taken me decades to get to this point. Like I said before, I wish I had this framework. What is it now? 10,000 hours to become an expert? Yeah, that's freaking true. That's how it goes. You really do have to put a lot of time and effort into understanding some kind of topic, whatever your specialty is. And so Eurodollar University making available to you decades of study and research, and not just decades of any study and research, it's decades of study and research that nobody else did. It's completely different from everything else that you hear in the mainstream, because again, the mainstream is leading you in the wrong direction. So the biggest benefit here is having access to all of that information, all of that background, without having to spend year after year after year digging through primary source material and reading circulars from the 1960s and trying to fit them into some kind of comprehensive framework for the overall evolution of the monetary system, and understanding it within a useful background of what monetary theory is to begin with in basic monetary economics, which, as we talked about at Eurodollar University, modern economists they don't care about the monetary system. In fact, DSGE models don't even have an input for the financial system or any financial inputs whatsoever. So when you're talking to an economist, they don't even talk about the financial system, or even really spend a whole lot of their effort trying to figure out how that fits into their economic models to begin with. So it's really about filling in these huge gaps and having access to information, as well as a wealth of knowledge and experience that you're not going to get anywhere else.
All right, can you just give us one more pitch to Eurodollar University, and then we'll close it off?
I think I just did. It really, look, that's the whole reason I'm here. The reason we started Eurodollar University to begin with was because nobody else was doing it. In fact, it was an encouragement. You go back to the earliest Eurodollar University. The first time I used that term was with Eric Townsend and Macro Voices. This was, a decade ago, even more than a decade ago. When was that? 2015, 2016, somewhere in there. We did the first Eurodollar University because people were starting to realize they were not getting the whole picture. Most people, Brent Johnson's a great guy, and he's a good example here. A lot of people, and to his credit, he said, I saw things the wrong way. I followed the mainstream on all this stuff. I realized that I needed to start thinking something different because we're missing something. And I provided what that missing ingredient was. Throughout the 2010s, people kept thinking the dollar's going to crash, inflation's going to soar because the Fed printed money. So at the very least, Eurodollar University, or the earliest incarnations of it, the stuff that I used to write back then, was telling people and helping people understand what QE really was, how the system really works, and therefore all the implications. And it was, another thing, interest rates. Interest rates throughout the 2010s told you, the market told you in no uncertain terms, there wasn't going to be any inflation. It also told you there was no money printing either. That's why the bond market, and being able to interpret the bond market in the 2010s, which looked a lot more like the 1930s, meant that you were able to understand what was really happening in the 2010s, as it was pretty much the opposite of what everybody else was saying, or at least what the vast majority of people were saying at the time. So having access to that experience, the understanding, the background, the history, the signals, the interpretations, the framework, as we just went over here, the process. That's what Eurodollar University is. We give you, and my pledge is to give you as much information and understanding as I possibly can, packaged as easy as possible as it is for you to follow, understanding this is very complex material. It's not something you're going to give somebody in a 2-page or 2-paragraph summary, but to give you a comprehensive view of not just material, but the whole thing in a framework that you won't get anywhere else.
All right, Jeff. Thank you truly from everyone watching right now. This was 2.5 hours of Eurodollar University madness. Thank you.
Yeah, I know. We could keep going all night too. That's the thing.
Well, I know that you need a rest.
There is so much other stuff. I mean, that's nothing says that this is a big thing more than we've gone to, what is it, 2.5 hours, and we could probably go for another 2.5 hours and still just scratching the surface. But that's what Eurodollar University is. There's just so much material to go over and cover, thanks to the gaps and holes that the economists have left for us. So, I mean, as always, thank you, Josh. I really appreciate you putting this together. See, I'm already getting to my limit, though. Max, I'm starting to stumble, unable to talk. But thanks for putting this together. Really appreciate everybody joining me here. I hope we're impressed upon you how important things are and how things are moving, and the how important it is to stay on top of not just what's happening, but what it actually means. So I really appreciate everybody attending, everybody showing up. See you again tomorrow on YouTube, or at least Saturday, whatever day we post on.